Reagan Campaign Strategy Memo June 1984. Dick Waghorn 2, 5. Ronald Reagan's campaign strategists succeeded in their effort to make Reagan the personification of a mythic, heroic America for millions of Americans. Indiana Ron vs. Wimp Mondale and the Temple of Gloom. Heroic America is white, Christian, patriarchal and preordained as number one. Heroic America is a national insecurity state, a dangerous blend of arrogance and paranoia. Reagan campaigned on the slogan, America is back, standing tall. America the victim has been besieged by hostile forces at home and abroad, welfare cheats, reverse discriminators, unilateral disarmers, Japanese car makers, Islamic fanatics, Marxist-Leninist communist totalitarian terrorists. They're all out to get us. The Russians and their proxies are lurking just outside our many windows of vulnerability. So from Grenada to Angola to Nicaragua, America is proud to be a bully and call it other things, rescue missions, freedom fighting, striking back against international terrorism. Sometimes, though, the players forget the script and speak straight from the heart. In February 1984, Secretary of State George Shultz visited Grenada and said, "The terrain is more rugged than I imagined, but it is certainly a lovely piece of real estate." Free world is just another term for real estate. American century real estate. Freedom fighters are the landlord's goons. 2. The Vietnam War and the Iranian Revolution shattered the confidence of American Century Inc. Businessweek did a feature story on the decline of U.S. power, the new debate over guns and butter, complete with a weeping Statue of Liberty on the cover. In the words of the Middle East chief of a major U.S. bank, it was easy in the pre-Vietnam days to look at an area of the map and say, "That's ours," and feel pretty good about investing there. That's no longer the case, as Iran has made so terribly clear. American investment overseas is going to happen at a reduced rate until we can redefine our world. Pax Americana to Realpolitik. U.S. policy planners carried out their most successful effort to redefine our world with the construction of a Pax Americana amid the World War II ruins of German, British, and Japanese imperialism. The Council on Foreign Relations War and Peace Studies provided the basic blueprint for political, military, and economic hegemony. The post-war international monetary system, known as the Bretton Woods system, revolved around the US dollar, and the free world flourished in the strong embrace of Washington's global military supremacy. Business approved. As the president of Business International put it, this was one of the periods of freedom, freedom to invest, freedom to trade, freedom to have economic intercourse. Stability and freedom. 3. Within the United States, the post-war order was legitimate by the ideology of Cold War liberalism and enforced with wholesale McCarthyite repression. Cold War liberalism promised guns and butter, a strong national security state to contain the Red Menace, and a strong welfare state to ward off economic depression, co-opt organized labor, and keep people dreaming the American dream. By the late 60s, however, Cold War liberalism was in crisis at home and abroad. In March 1968, the unofficial group of political, military, and business leaders advising President Johnson, the Wise Men, acknowledged the crisis in Cold War liberalism with their realization, following the Tet Offensive, that there was no light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam. Faced with a request for over 200,000 additional troops, most of the Wise Men told Johnson to de-escalate and press for negotiations. With public opposition rising, the war could not be won at a politically acceptable cost. In the words of Roger Morris, a former aide to Dean Acheson, McGeorge Bundy, and Henry Kissinger, the Wise Men were the most senior members of the foreign policy establishment. The 100 or so officials and ex-officials, patrons and protégés, who had dominated American foreign policy for the last quarter century. The Wise Men included McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor to Presidents Kennedy and Johnson; George Ball, former Undersecretary of State; Cyrus Vance, former Deputy Secretary of Defense and later Secretary of State; John J. McCloy, former Assistant Secretary of War; Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State; Henry Cabot Lodge, former ambassador to the United Nations and to South Vietnam, General Maxwell Taylor, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. 3. The problems of empire. Historical parallels can be overdrawn. But in historical terms, the US emerged from World War I as an imperial power and has had to live with the problems of empire ever since. For great powers to survive and perhaps even to flourish, in the words of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, their leaders must understand the connections between the military, political, and economic aspects of power. OE_1956 to 1965, when empires cannot produce a coal vital to their survival within their borders, they become vulnerable to decline unless they secure their sources of supply by effective military or political means. For the Roman Empire it was grain from the then fertile fields of Egypt and North Africa. For the US, beginning with the mid-50s, it has been the relatively cheap oil from the Middle East. Cuba was to show another of the recurring problems of maintaining the American empire and inability to contain and channel the process of radical economic and social change in the Third World. 1965 to 1970, having taken on too large a share of the costs of collective security, the US discovered in Vietnam another of the ancient problems of empire, the high cost in resources of defending its perimeters. With the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1965, the Senate almost blindly followed President Lyndon B. Johnson in committing an unsuspecting US public to a land war in Asia. The costs of this war for a society that was beginning to commit more and more resources to meeting the ambitious social goals began to produce the economic strains, inflation, and a weakened dollar that have haunted the US for nearly 15 years. 1971 to 1979, the failure to protect oil supplies that began with Suez, combined with the economic and political strains caused by Vietnam, produced a long series of reversals for the US in the 1970s. The decade began with the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary agreement. That year also produced the first US trade deficit of the 20th century, which fed protectionist sentiments in the US, including a domestic political assault on US multinational corporations. The most serious blow of the decade, though, was the loss of control over oil supplies represented by OPEC's successful power grab in 1973. The decline of US power, the new debate over guns and butter, Business Week, March 12, 1979, pages 40 to 41. For Reagan, trilateralism, and the neoliberals. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger took over from Lyndon Johnson and produced another redefinition of US policy. They seized the long-neglected opportunity to exploit the Chinese-Soviet split, strategically and economically, and reopened the door to the People's Republic of China. Détente replaced the Cold War as the guiding strategy for US-Soviet relations. Foreign policy was rooted in realpolitik, a less ideological, more pragmatic calculus of strategic, economic, and political interests. Under the Nixon Doctrine, the U.S. attempted to delegate some of its responsibility as global policeman to regional deputies, Vietnamization under Thieu, Iran as gendarme of the Persian Gulf under the Shah. It was economic policy, not foreign policy, that was Nixon's undoing among the establishment. Intercapitalist rivalry had heightened in the 60s as the West European and Japanese economies recovered while the U.S. economy weakened under the weight of guns and butter. In 1971 the U.S. ran a then unaccustomed trade deficit, paying more for imports than it earned from exports. Monetary stability was threatened by a byproduct of worldwide military and economic endeavors, a growing buildup of dollars outside the U.S. rather than negotiate necessary reforms in the international economic system. Nixon attempted to reassert U.S. primacy with a series of protectionist measures remembered as the Nixon shocks. International bankers and corporate executives were outraged when Nixon suspended the convertibility of dollars into gold, breaking the Bretton Woods agreements. As the 70s unfolded, the Pax Americana was challenged further by national liberation struggles in the colonies and neo-colonies, OPEC oil commodity power, Third World calls for a new international economic order and a deepening crisis of democracy at home. It was time for a third redefinition of world order under the aegis of trilateralism. Trilateralism. In the wake of the Nixon shocks, a group of multinational corporate executives, bankers, academics, and politicians from North America, Western Europe and Japan founded the Trilateral Commission. Registered David Rockefeller became the North American chairman and Zbigniew Brzezinski the executive director. The key to trilateralism would be the collective management of global interdependence by the trilateral powers. Trilateralism advanced under the Ford-Kissinger administration with the first Western Economic Summit. With the election of Commission member Jimmy Carter in 1976, trilateralism had an unprecedented chance to move from theory to practice. As former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski notes in his autobiography, all the key foreign policy decision-makers of the Carter administration had previously served in the Trilateral Commission. Registered these included, among others, Vice President Walter 5. Mondale, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, Defense Secretary Harold Brown, Treasury Secretary W. Michael Blumenthal, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency Director Paul Warnke and United Nations Ambassador Andrew Young. Crisis of democracy. Unfortunately for Carter, the president could no longer govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, as a Trilateral Commission report described an earlier era. In the U.S. section of that report, The Crisis of Democracy, Samuel Huntington laments the erosion of traditional forms of public and private authority and the widespread questioning of the legitimacy of hierarchy, coercion, discipline, secrecy, and deception, all of which are, in some measure, inescapable attributes of the process of government. Registered the crisis of democracy was that too many people participated too much, or attempted to do so. Congress, the media, value-oriented intellectuals and, most importantly, the public. Previously passive or unorganized groups in the population, blacks, Indians, Chicanos, white ethnic groups, students, and women now embarked on concerted efforts to establish their claims to opportunities, positions, rewards, and privileges, which they had not considered themselves entitled to before. The minorities and special interests, representing most of the population, were challenging the establishment which ruled in the holy name of the national interest. The crisis of democracy was unusually blunt about the distinction between egalitarian, participatory democracy and the anemic democracy beloved by the establishment. The effective operation of a democratic political system usually requires some measure of apathy and non-involvement on the part of some individuals and groups. The greatest threat to democracy is democracy itself. The vulnerability of democratic government in the United States thus comes not primarily from external threats, though such threats are real, nor from internal subversion from the left or the right, although both possibilities could exist, but rather from the internal dynamics of democracy itself in a highly educated, mobilized, and participant society. The senators started in deception, secret deals, I had to mind them. That's what I was on the whole list of political payoffs hired for charges. Dan Wasserman. 6. Reagan, Trilateralism, and the Neoliberals. If people's expectations of government were getting out of hand and democracy was running amok, it was time for apathy and the politics of less enforced through recession, austerity, and a blame the victim campaign against the special interests. As usual, corporate America's counterattack would be cloaked in the mantle of the national interest. Jimmy Carter was the first neoliberal president. He made fiscal conservatism the bipartisan alternative to the welfare state. Businessweek asserted in 1979, if the decline in U.S. power is to be arrested, the trend towards spending a smaller share of the federal budget on defense must be reversed, and economic policy must change in a way that encourages investment at the expense of consumption. Trilateralist Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker put it even more bluntly, the standard of the average American has to decline. Accommodation, shaping the forces of history. A minimum of social justice and reform will be necessary for stability in the long run. Towards a renovated international system, Trilateral Commission, 1977. According to Brzezinski, the Carter administration had 10 basic foreign policy objectives. 1. To engage Western Europe, Japan, and the other advanced democracies in a closer political cooperation through the increasing institutionalization of consultative relationships, and thereby to promote wider macroeconomic coordination pointing toward a stable and open monetary system. 2. To weave a worldwide web of bilateral, political, and, where appropriate, economic relations with the new emerging regional influentials, thereby widening, in keeping with historical circumstances, our earlier reliance on the Atlantic community. 3. To develop more accommodating North-South relations, political as well as economic, so as to develop greater economic stability and growth in the Third World, diminish hostility toward the U.S., lessen Soviet influence, and increase the stake those nations would have in good relations with the North and the West. 4. To push U.S. Soviet strategic arms limitation talks into strategic arms reduction talks, using the foregoing as an entering wedge for a more stable U.S. Soviet relationship. At the same time, we wanted to rebuff Soviet incursions both by supporting our friends and by ameliorating the sources of conflict which the Soviets exploit. We wanted to match Soviet ideological expansion by a more affirmative American posture on global human rights, while seeking consistently to make détente both more comprehensive and more reciprocal. 5. To normalize U.S.-Chinese relations because we saw that relationship as a central stabilizing element of our global policy and a keystone for peace. 6. To obtain a comprehensive Middle East settlement, without which the further radicalization of the Arab world and the re-entry of the Soviet Union into the Middle East could not be avoided. 7. To set in motion a progressive and peaceful transformation of South Africa toward a biracial democracy while in the meantime forging elsewhere a coalition of moderate black African leaders in order to stem continental radicalization and 7. Eliminate the Soviet-Cuban presence from the continent. We wanted to help achieve majority rule in Zimbabwe. 8. To restrict the level of global armaments, unilaterally and through international agreements, cooperate in international restraints on nuclear proliferation and sign a comprehensive test ban treaty, ratify the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, the Peaceful Nuclear Explosion Treaty. 9. To enhance global sensitivity to human rights. 10. To maintain a defense posture capable of deterring the Soviet Union, both on the strategic and the conventional level, from hostile acts and from political pressure. 4. Speaking about change in the Third World, Brzezinski explained that the Carter administration is not trying to build dams against the forces of history but rather to channel these forces in a positive direction. Registered the positive direction, of course, is the direction which serves the interest of Western capitalism. A fundamental premise of accommodation was the belief that the West could beat the Soviet Union at the development game of aid, trade, and investment. Blind confrontation in defense of the status quo along the lines of a military chess game would only give the Soviets more opportunities for influence and risk a no-win superpower showdown. Andrew Young on the East-West competition for Africa. The blunting of the Soviet political advantage in Africa continued with the promulgation of the Anglo-American Plan for Zimbabwean Independence and the Western Initiative on Namibia in 1977, and then with the Lancaster House talks on Zimbabwe in 1979. This process must be viewed as an example of highly effective implementation of the Carter administration's strategy of protecting American strategic interests through diplomatic means. Just 5 years ago, the prospects for African-American relations were extremely bleak. The prospect of Soviet hegemony over the resource-rich southern African region represented a serious strategic threat to Western interests, and much of Africa saw armed struggle with Soviet weapons as the only course to the total decolonization of the continent. Nothing has affected the East-West competition for African influence and resources as much as the African realization that the problems of hunger, disease, illiteracy, and underdevelopment are equally as intractable as the problems of racism and colonialism. Despite embarrassingly low levels of official development assistance by the West, the availability of Western private investment and a century-long commitment of Christian missionary education have given the West an almost complete domination over the Soviet bloc when it comes to African development. Source: Andrew Young, The United States and Africa, Victory for Diplomacy, Foreign Affairs, America and the World 1980, pages 649 and 656. 8. Reagan, trilateralism, and the neoliberals. Debt diplomacy replaced gunboat diplomacy as the weapon of choice in enforcing neocolonialism. For example, following an unsuccessful CIA campaign to destabilize the Manley government, the Jamaican experiment in democratic socialism was derailed in large part through the International Monetary Fund's program of austerity and stabilization, which undermined the economic and social progress upon which Manley's popularity was based. In southern Africa, the strategy was to take the battle for majority rule off the battlefield and into the conference room. The US and Britain worked together to arrange an independence settlement for Zimbabwe which, it was hoped, would preserve neocolonialism as it dismantled white settler colonialism. In Namibia, a contact group made up of 5 Western powers, the US, Britain, Canada, West Germany, and France, negotiated and renegotiated the basis for an independence settlement which included SWAPO. This bold attempt at collective crisis management was derailed again and again by South Africa. In Nicaragua, discussed extensively in Chapter 3, the counter-revolutionary strategy was to impose a moderate government through a negotiated Somoza resignation or military intervention under the auspices of the Organization for American States. When that failed, trilateralists hoped to use economic aid to bolster the private sector and forestall Nicaraguan dependence upon the Soviet Union and Cuba by encouraging continued reliance on Western aid and trade. The Carter administration tried to learn from its too little, too late approach in Nicaragua and defuse the growing popular revolution in El Salvador by backing the reformist military coup of October 1979. Land reform was seen as key to winning the population's hearts and minds. But, as in Vietnam, land reform was always an appendage of counterinsurgency in the effort to reimpose stability. In February 1980, Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Arnulfo Romero wrote to President Carter and pleaded that U.S. aid be withheld. He also called on Christian Democrats to resign from the repressive junta. Your presence is covering the repressive character of this government, especially abroad. You are an important political force. It is urgent that you question how best you can use that force in favor of the poor, as isolated and impotent members of a government controlled by the repressive military, or as one more force that incorporates itself into a broad project of popular government. On March 23, Archbishop Romero ended his sermon with these famous words directed to soldiers, National Guardsmen and the police. We should like the government to take seriously the fact that reforms dyed by so much blood are worth nothing. In the name of God, in the name of our tormented people who have suffered so much, I beseech you, I beg you, I order you in the name of God, stop the repression. 9. Romero was gunned down the following day. Robert Armstrong and Janet Schenck write, in the most bizarre rendition yet of the U.S. media's portrayal of the conflict, as a war between two extremes, the Washington Post reported on March 25, there was no immediate indication if leftist or rightist extremists killed the Archbishop. Both factions are waging a bloody war for control of the Central American nation. The day after the Archbishop's funeral, non-lethal military aid was approved for the junta, including cargo trucks, radar, riot control gear and night vision tracking equipment. As repression intensified and frustrated reformers left the successive military-civilian juntas to join the new opposition Democratic Revolutionary Front, the Washington propaganda refrain droned on to drown out the bullets of counterinsurgency, moderate centrist government battling the extremists of left and right. The refrain droned on even as the top 5 FDR leaders including Enrique Alvarez, Minister of Agriculture until January 1980 were taken from the Jesuit high school where they were preparing a press conference and tortured, murdered, and mutilated, even as 4 U.S. churchwomen were brutally raped and murdered, and even as 2 U.S. land reform advisors were shot down at the Sheraton International Hotel. 3 days before leaving office, Jimmy Carter broke the suspension of military aid which had been in place following the killing of the churchwomen and ordered an emergency airlift of military aid to El Salvador. His excuse: captured documents secret, of course had revealed the guerrillas were receiving assistance from Cuba and other communist nations, Ronald Reagan would take the Carter pretext and run with it. Under Washington's new guidelines we bagged our week's limit. Bill Malden. 10 Reagan, Trilateralism, and the Neoliberals. In his memoirs, Carter has few words for Nicaragua and El Salvador. His final passage on the subject is self-serving, stopping short of his final actions as president. Trouble was brewing in Central America. We were trying to maintain our ties with Nicaragua, to keep it from turning to Cuba and the Soviet Union, and at the same time to help the people of El Salvador. They are going through a bloodbath down there. They don't have anybody in the jails. They're all dead. It's their accepted way of enforcing the so-called law. Diary, December 11, 1980. I was determined that the murderers of the nuns be brought to justice, that elections be scheduled, that some equitable system of justice be established, and that promised land reforms be carried out. We had to convince the Salvadorans that brutal persecution of their own people was the major obstacle to their economic and political stability. Their top priority was to obtain more military weapons, but we held firm to our policy. 8. Unmanageable contradictions. By Carter's midterm, it was clear that trilateralism was in trouble. Instead of channeling the forces of history in a positive neocolonial direction, the U.S. was being swept up in the currents of contradictions. In 1980, Brzezinski expressed the central foreign policy contradiction, but he insisted it was merely two sides of the same coin. The administration, he said, is trying to do two things. 1. To make the United States historically relevant to a world of genuinely profound change, and secondly, to improve the United States' position in the geostrategic balance with the Soviet Union. 9. For the U.S. to be genuinely relevant to Third World change, the U.S. would have to change its overriding goal of global domination, but trilateralism aimed for stability of Western dominance, not self-destruction. Brzezinski increasingly advocated militaristic geostrategic policies at the expense of long-range accommodation. Vance continued to promote accommodation, with less success. Reflecting on the development of Carter's policy, Brzezinski writes, "I felt that the United States should use its power to improve the human condition, but I put stronger emphasis perhaps than Carter on the notion that strengthening American power was the necessary point of departure." Indeed, later on, when a choice between the two had to be made, between projecting U.S. power or enhancing human rights, I felt that power had to come first. To degree the Carter administration grew more confrontational as the forces of history appeared less manageable. Détente remained a two-way street. The Soviets were not embracing the icon of capitalism or tying their Third World policy to Washington's good housekeeping seal of approval. The post-Vietnam strategy of using surrogate gendarmes to police Western interests collapsed under the Iranian Revolution. Rebellions and revolutions multiplied at too fast a rate for accommodation. The aim was to install pro-US moderates, such as Antonio Guzman in the Dominican Republic or Shapur. 11. Backfire in Iran. Washington could only attempt to cultivate good relations with so many radicals like Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe or Nicaragua's Sandinistas. Plentiful foreign aid, an essential element of accommodation, was not forthcoming from Congress. And, after the Camp David Accords, Israel and Egypt split the lion's share of foreign aid funds. Having lost Iran, the Carter administration was determined to prevent further change in the Persian Gulf. Carter cried Soviet threat and launched the Rapid Deployment Force in June 1979, months before the November 4 takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the late December Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Carter unleashed the new patriotism with draft registration and hostage drama jingoism. The January 1980 State of the Union address contained the so-called Carter Doctrine. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. Carter also fueled the proxy Cold War with Cuba. In October 1979, after discovering a contingent of Soviet troops in Cuba which had been there for 17 years with Washington's knowledge, Carter announced the establishment of a permanent Caribbean military task force. He also pledged increased economic assistance to ensure the ability of troubled peoples to resist social turmoil and possible communist domination too. Meanwhile, Carter's 1980 Presidential Directive 59 committed U.S. war planners to prepare for fighting a prolonged, but limited nuclear war. Resurgent jingo militarism had its price. The SALT II treaty was never ratified. A diplomatic settlement in Central America, following the Zimbabwe example, became politically improbable. The pillars of trilateralist foreign policy accommodation and détente appeared to be made of sand. And, most importantly, by helping shift the policy debate to the right, Carter put himself and trilateralism further on the defensive. By the time of Ronald Reagan's inauguration, the trilateral accommodationist consensus had fractured. In a 1980 address to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, David Rockefeller asserted, "We cannot count on an alliance of angels to defend the free world." Writing in the fall of 1980, the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Thomas Hughes, observed, "Quickly unlearning all the harsh lessons of the recent past, many are tempted again to mistake a defense build-up for a foreign policy." Meanwhile, the great simplifiers on the right are striking the chords of mythology, petulance, false pride, and nostalgia. American and world politics, warned Hughes, are on a collision course. SEAR, MIRI. The relevant policy spectrum. Few in the politically relevant spectrum these days would challenge the assertion that the Soviet Union is a menace. Yet there is still disagreement about the nature of the beast and how to tame it. Dmitry Simes' Foreign Policy, 1981. Polarization has left the center looking more like the Bermuda Triangle. Politicians who go there tend to disappear. The right-wing undertow, combined with the disintegrating waves on the left, leaves very little in between except bubbles. Thomas Hughes, Foreign Policy, 1985. Alexis Duran-Lopez. If the politically relevant spectrum for the Carter period ran from Andrew Young on the left, to Cyrus Vance in the center, Zbigniew Brzezinski on the right and the neoconservatives and new rightists on the far right, in the Reagan era we find Young off the chart and Vance on the left. The dominant Republicrat spectrum is sharply skewed to the right. The real left, which proposes a foreign policy based on non-intervention and respect for self-determination, is closed out. Today's relative left is a depleted outpost of traditional liberals such as standard-bearer Ted Kennedy, retiring House Speaker Tip O'Neill and beleaguered Geraldine Ferraro. Neoliberals such as Rep. Stephen Solars and Democratic presidential aspirants Gary Hart and Mario Cuomo are at center-left. Zbigniew Brzezinski is center-left in theory and centrist in practice. Such pragmatic conservatives as Henry Kissinger, Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole and Secretary of State George Shultz claim the so-called center, with a heavy lean to the right, apparent in Shultz's anti-terrorist crusade, for example. Vice President George Bush is in the center, notwithstanding his desperate pandering to the far right, which even whiny. The relevant policy spectrum 13. George Will finds offensive. Says Will, the unpleasant sound Bush is emitting as he traipses from one conservative gathering to another is a thin, tinny ARF, the sound of a lapdog. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger is a center-right megamilitarist who, heretofore, has liked piling up his weapons more than using them. The right considers him too pro-Arab, a legacy of his former employment with the Bechtel Corporation, a multinational construction firm heavily invested in the Middle East, to be one of them. The right is a crowded place with Reagan himself, Republican presidential hopeful Jack Kemp, real American heroine Jeane Kirkpatrick, Young Turk congressional leader Newt Gingrich, Attorney General Ed Meese, etc. Even further out is the far right of Jesse Helms and Jerry Falwell, once considered too extremist to be respectable and relevant, now considered too relevant not to be respected. At a meeting of his reincarnated Liberty Federation, George Bush hailed Falwell, America is in crying need of the moral vision you will bring to our political life. About the only factions of the right that aren't respectable are neo-Nazis and survivalists dedicated to the violent overthrow of the government. Loyal neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and average Armageddonists are quite welcome. Speaking about his administration, Ronald Reagan has said, "Sometimes our right hand doesn't know what our far right hand is doing." So it goes for the relevant foreign policy spectrum. Wait till you see Han George Bush America FSBAC. Ronald Reagan takes care of the first woman once our leader/enthusiasm and vice presidential nominee prosperity are everywhere/ optimism. Oppo or unity. Take hers, he may be qualified, dear, but gosh, it's all so wonderful, I think he's too emotional. Dan Wasserman. 14. The elite spectrum offers up three basic foreign policy choices in varying states of confusion: unlimited containment or rollback, moderate or limited containment, and liberal containment. There's agreement across the spectrum that the United States must draw the line against perceived threats to U.S. interests. There's disagreement over where, when, and how. Virtually everyone agrees that the Middle East is an area of vital importance because its oil is considered the lifeblood of Western capitalism *, even on the Middle East. However, policymakers don't agree about how best to police it, e.g. whether and how to station U.S. ground troops permanently in the region, how best to protect the Saudi regime, how to deal with the Palestinian problem. The rollbackers rehash their ideas in such organizations as the Committee on the Present Danger, the Hoover Institution, and the Heritage Foundation. Their journals include Commentary and National Review. Proponents of limited containment congregate in the American Enterprise Institute, Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies, Council on Foreign Relations, and the Trilateral Commission, and write for such journals as CSIS's Washington Quarterly and the CFR's Foreign Affairs. Liberals also belong to the Trilateral Commission and CFR, but their preferred vehicle of expression is Foreign Policy, published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Rollback. Unlimited containment is, of course, a contradiction in terms. A more accurate label would be unlimited intervention or rollback. Rollbackers say draw the line everywhere and redraw it in Nicaragua, Angola, Eastern Europe, and ultimately the Soviet Union itself. Anything less will mean inevitable American surrender in the ongoing Third World War. In the words of the Committee of Santa Fe *, World War III is almost over. The Soviet Union, operating under the cover of increasing nuclear superiority, is strangling the Western industrialized nations by interdicting their oil and ore supplies and is encircling the People's Republic of China. Latin America and Southern Asia are the scenes of strife of the third phase of World War III. America is everywhere in retreat. The impending loss of the petroleum of the Middle East and potential interdiction of the sea routes spanning the Indian Ocean, along with the Soviet satellization of the mineral zone of southern Africa, foreshadow the Finlandization of Western Europe and the alienation of Japan. The Committee of Santa Fe was comprised of L. Francis Bouchy, Roger W. Fontaine, David C. Jordan, Gordon Sumner, and Louis Tams, report editor. Under Reagan, Fontaine became a National Security Council advisor for Latin American affairs. Sumner became a special advisor to Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Thomas Enders, and Tams became ambassador to Colombia. Philippines, West Germany, Turkey, Somalia, Greece, Italy, Subic Bay, Naval Stuttgart, Army 3 Air Bases. Berbera, Airfield, Crete, Naval Naples, Naval Station, Clark Headquarters, and Naval Base. Base, Nia Macri, Base, Vicenza Air Force Base. Ramstein Air Base. Oman Communications Air Base, Sardinia, Airfield and Egypt Base, Athens, Air Submarine Base, South Korea Diego Garcia Fleet Support Airfield. Base, Suda Bay, Patrol Aircraft Seoul, Army Post, Airfield and Base. Naval Base. Base. Ozan, Air Base, Naval Base. Kuzan, Air Base, Pusan, Port. Ascension is WNAE Base. NAE Saint-Zie. Rota, naval base, Torigen, air base. 10. Guam, Japan air and naval base. Tokyo, air base. Yokosuka, naval. Portugal. Azores, air base. Australia base, Sasebo. Exmouth, naval base, Greenland, Bermuda, Britain. Communications, Misawa, air base, Thule, air base. Naval air base. Mildenhall, air base, Zama, Army. Panama base, Greenham Woomera, camp, Okinawa, Iceland. Cuba Army post, common, air. Electronic air, naval, and Keflavik, naval. Guantanamo naval base, Laken listening post. Marines base. Air base. Bay, naval base. And air base. Heath, air base. New York Times. Military bases around the globe. 10 years ago there were 323 sizable installations outside the continental United States, including a few in American territories such as Guam. Today, the total is 359, not including foreign military bases to which American forces have access but not control. In contrast, the Soviet Union has come but recently to what military officers call power projection and has few military units abroad, save for the massive land and air forces occupying Eastern Europe and the forces that invaded Afghanistan in late 1979. Soviet ships and aircraft are limited to access to bases in countries such as South Yemen, Ethiopia, Vietnam, and Cuba. According to World Military and Social Expenditures 1985, the United States has military bases in 40 foreign countries and territories, supported by an advantage in naval power and a wide-ranging web of alliances. The U.S. has 95,000 military personnel overseas, in addition to 385,000 in NATO, Europe and Japan. The Soviet Union has forces in 22 countries and an estimated 23,000 military personnel abroad, in addition to 115,000 fighting in Afghanistan and 640,000 in Warsaw Pact countries. Richard Halloran, New York Times, July 24, 1983 by Ruth Legar-Savard, World Priorities, Washington, D.C. 16. Even the Caribbean, America's maritime crossroad and petroleum refining center, is becoming a Marxist-Leninist lake. Never before has the Republic been in such jeopardy from its exposed southern flank. It is time to seize the initiative, it is time to sound a clarion call for freedom, dignity, and national self-interest which will echo the spirit of the American people. Either a Pax Sovietica or a worldwide counter-projection of American power is in the offing. The hour of decision can no longer be postponed. Degree. To the rollbackers, détente is just another word for treason, a plot by multinational corporate one-worlders out to make a buck, whether in rubles, yen, or pesos. Arms control is unilateral disarmament. Accommodation is appeasement. To the rollbackers, the Panama Canal treaties and the Zimbabwe independence settlement were not new leases on a neocolonial future, they were sellouts. Rollbackers call for a new nationalism. U.S. policy should not be moderated to preserve cohesion in the Atlantic Alliance. If the ungrateful Europeans won't go along with born-again America, then the U.S. should go it alone. Enduring peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union is unthinkable. The rollbackers lament the Reagan administration's lost opportunity to further a process of disintegration within the Soviet Empire during the Polish crisis of 1981-82. Commentary editor Norman Podhoretz explains. When martial law was declared in Poland, thanks to the inability of the Poles to pay the interest on their debts to Western banks, there was an opportunity to keep the crisis at a boil by declaring Poland in default. No risk of war was posed by such a policy, and yet from the haste with which the United States and even more the West Europeans shrank from it, one might have thought that they expected the Soviets to launch a nuclear strike if the West refused to roll over the Polish loans registered. To the rollbackers, the Soviet Union is an evil empire with a master plan for world domination through terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and military superiority. U.S. nuclear superiority under Star Wars is seen as necessary and attainable. In the rollbackers' nuclearized crusade to vanquish the anti-capitalist, God is on their side. For many rollbackers, Armageddon is the preordained preface to the Second Coming and its theocracy of Christian believers. Ronald Reagan is the believer-in-chief. In 1971, then-Governor Reagan remarked, in the 38th chapter of Ezekiel, it says that the land of Israel will come under attack by the armies of the ungodly nations, and it says that Libya will be among them. Do you understand the significance of that? Libya has now gone communist, and that's a sign that the day of Armageddon isn't that far off. Everything is falling into place. Ezekiel tells us that Gog, the nation that will lead all of the other powers of darkness against Israel, will come out of the north. Now that Russia has become communist and atheistic, now that Russia has set itself against God. Now it fits the description of Gog perfectly. In 1983, President Reagan told People magazine, theologians have said that never has there ever been a time in which so many of the relevant policy spectrum 17 prophecies are coming together. There have been times in the past when people thought the end of the world was coming and so forth, but never anything like this. In the fundamentalist prophecies of Armageddon, good Christians will be saved from nuclear holocaust and lifted to heaven in the rapture. Armageddonists don't need to believe Star Wars will provide an impenetrable shield. It just has to help out by buying some time for the rapture. Egostrategics. When it comes to the Third World, the Ivy League foreign policy establishment has its geostrategics, epitomized by Henry Kissinger. Right-wingers prefer egostrategics. It's very simple. If you're not for US, you're against US. If you're for US, you're the moderate autocrat of a moderately repressive regime like Pinochet of Chile, Chun of South Korea, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, Zia of Pakistan and Mobutu of Zaire. If you're against US, you're a totalitarian dictator, like Presidents Ortega of Nicaragua and Dos Santos of Angola. If you're for US, you're democratic freedom fighters, like the Contras and the Angolan UNITA force headed by Jonas Savimbi. If you're against US, you're Soviet Libyan Cuban-backed Marxist-Leninist terrorists, like the Salvadoran FMLN, South African ANC and Palestine Liberation Organization. Egostrategists don't accommodate and they don't apologize. Being American means never having to say you're sorry. At the 1984 Republican Convention, Jeane Kirkpatrick railed against the Democrats who always blame America first. Just as former UN Ambassador Andrew Young epitomized the congenial Carter style, former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick epitomizes the arrogance and paranoia of Reaganism. A prototypical neoconservative, Kirkpatrick was a partisan of Cold War liberal Hubert Humphrey before becoming a co-founder of the Coalition for a Democratic Majority, which opposed George McGovern's candidacy for president in 1972. Neoconservative Democrats merged with right-wing Republicans in the Committee on the Present Danger, founded in 1976 to campaign against détente. Kirkpatrick is a specialist in the disinformation and doublespeak of egostrategics. Generally speaking, traditional autocrats tolerate social inequities, brutality, and poverty, while revolutionary autocracies create them. Traditional autocrats leave in place existing allocations of wealth, power, status, and other resources which in most traditional societies favor an affluent few and maintain masses in poverty. But they worship traditional gods and observe traditional taboos. They do not disturb the habitual rhythms of work and leisure, habitual places of residence, habitual patterns of family and personal relations. Because the miseries of traditional life are familiar, they are bearable to ordinary people, who growing up in the society, learn to cope. As children born to untouchables in India acquire the skills and attitudes necessary for survival in the miserable roles they are destined to fill. Such societies create no refugees, she adds. Such is the depth of Kirkpatrick's much acclaimed scholarly knowledge. In Kirkpatrick's world enforced by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, refugees from moderately repressive regimes are not refugees, they are self-serving fortune seekers. Ordinary people don't rebel, they habitually bear their traditional miseries unless the commies stir up trouble. If that happens, the U.S. objective is clear: reinstate order. The Supreme Court tightened the rules. Well-founded fear of persecution for political refugees who want to stay in your country is not enough. And the U.S. What kind of evidence a note from would be enough to your dictator? Dan Wasserman. The Relevant Policy Spectrum 19. As Kirkpatrick wrote in a published article, the problem confronting El Salvador is Thomas Hobbes's problem: how to establish order and authority in a society where there is none. She spells out her draconian views on the solution in an unpublished 1980 paper for the American Enterprise Institute, The Hobbes Problem: Order, Authority, and Legitimacy in Central America. Order, as John Stuart Mill emphasizes, is the preservation of all existing seeds. Heroes are people who make a special contribution to highly valued goods. Hernández Martínez is such a hero. General Maximiliano Hernández Martínez, who governed El Salvador from 1931 to 1944, was Minister of War in the cabinet of President Arturo Araujo when there occurred widespread uprisings said to be the work of communist agitators. General Hernández Martínez then staged a coup and ruthlessly suppressed the disorders, wiping out all those who participated, hunting down their leaders. It is sometimes said that 30,000 persons lost their lives in this process. To many Salvadorans, the violence of this repression seems less important than that of the fact of restored order and the 13 years of civil peace that ensued. The traditional death squads that pursue revolutionary activities and leaders in contemporary El Salvador call themselves Hernández Martínez brigades, seeking thereby to place themselves in El Salvador's political tradition and communicate their purposes. Degree. No wonder Kirkpatrick is considered a heroine by the Nicaraguan Contras. The Jean Kirkpatrick Task Force is the only Contra unit named for a foreigner. The men chose the name themselves, reports Contra leader Adolfo Calero. They listen to the voice of America and they admire Mrs. Kirkpatrick for her courage. Dan Wasserman. Limited containment. In the words of Dr. Brzezinski, advocates of limited containment reject nostalgia for the Pax Americana of the 1950s. And they reject the so-called escapism of the post-Vietnam 70s. 2. They look back on Nixon-Carter détente as overly optimistic, but look forward to a gradual resumption of a new form of détente. East-West détente is possible because the Soviets are seen, not as a demonic expansionist empire, but as a more traditional nationalist. 20. Reagan, trilateralism, and the neoliberals. Power, committed to preserving its own security and pragmatic in its attempts to expand its influence where there is relatively low cost and risk involved. A 1983 Trilateral Commission report, Trilateral Security, observes, the trilateral countries and the Soviet Union stand at a crossroads. They can either reach accommodations which will make possible a reduction of their military competition or face an increasingly unstable world in which the economic burdens of defense will grow and the security of all nations will diminish. Asterisk. Neo-interventionists differ from rollbackers in their assessment of Soviet power. The rollbackers envision U.S. Soviet competition as a global chess game with novel rules. Only Soviet advances matter. When pieces shift from the Soviet side to the U.S. side, you pretend not to notice. Non-aligned countries, needless to say, are considered Soviet pawns. The neo-interventionists count perceived wins and losses on both sides. In the trilateralist view, while it is appropriate to stress the extent and implications of Soviet military strength, the Soviet Union's weaknesses should not be overlooked. The Soviets are in a sense encircled by nations which are now alarmed by the aggressive nature of the Soviet system. The invasion of Afghanistan has led to a seemingly indefinite military entanglement for the Soviets which is proving costly in men and resources, as well as in its prejudicial impact on world public opinion. The Soviet-sponsored repression in Poland has set back, perhaps for a generation, the Soviet aim of having a stable situation on its western marches. And to the east, China gives every indication of remaining a strong rival of Soviet influence in Asia and elsewhere. Internally, many observers expect that the stagnation of the Soviet economy will deepen during the decade, and the shifting balance of nationalities will place non-Russians in the majority. 4. Advocates of limited containment reject a goal of nuclear superiority as destabilizing, unattainable and politically harmful to the Western alliance. They want multilateralism, shared policies among the allies, not go-it-alone unilateralism. Democracy Must Work, a trilateral agenda for the decade, co-authored by Brzezinski, recommends that the annual economic summits be renamed strategic or policy summits to reflect their embrace of a more comprehensive economic, political, and military program. 5. Neo-interventionists recognize limits on U.S. power, however reluctantly. Their more limited brand of militarism requires sustainable boosts in military spending. They advocate nuclear modernization with a moderate dose of arms control. Neo-interventionists want strengthened conventional forces, effective rapid deployment forces and a possible return to the draft. Some moderates support the no first use position advocated by Gerard Smith, chief SALT-I negotiator, McGeorge Bundy, former National Security Advisor, Robert McNamara, former Secretary of Defense and the relevant policy spectrum ZI. We're in luck. A distinguished panel of experts. Bob Engelhardt, World Bank President, and George Kennan, former ambassador to the Soviet Union. Registered Many don't. Limited containment means limited intervention, but there is no consensus definition. The need to establish priorities outside the vital Persian Gulf region is asserted with little elaboration in two important documents associated with the Council on Foreign Relations, The Soviet Challenge, a policy framework for the 1980s, produced by a commission on U.S. Soviet relations chaired by the editor-in-chief of Time Incorporated, Henry Grunwald, and Western Security, What Has Changed? What Should Be Done? A report prepared jointly by then CFR President Winston Lord and leaders of the British Royal Institute of International Affairs, the German Society for Foreign Affairs and the French Institute of International Relations. The Soviet Challenge observes, as a world power, the United States no doubt has some degree of interest almost anywhere. But the US cannot and should not involve itself at least militarily wherever adverse trends appear. Western Security asserts, we can also agree to take a relatively relaxed view about a number of so-called Marxist regimes in the Third World whose relationship with the Soviet Union is tenuous and cynical. No examples are given. More problematic, according to the report, is where the Soviet Union intervenes in a third world country and threatens its neighbors either through its own military pressure or through surrogates, such as the Cubans or Vietnamese. We have seen in recent years a disturbing series of such interventions in Africa, the Middle East and parts of Asia. 8. Would Central America have been included in the series of alleged interventions if the report had been prepared later? Again, the sweep of interests and allegations is broad, the definition of what is to be done rather abstract. Proposed a simple rule of moderate containment, the rule of need versus want. The West needs Persian Gulf oil, said Tucker, and thus has a vital interest in countering Soviet moves as well as blocking the admittedly more likely indigenous challenges to the internal order of pro-West regimes such as Saudi Arabia. U.S. ground troops should be prepositioned in the region to handle popular rebellions and other non-Soviet threats, and to provide a credible tripwire for nuclear force. Tucker is the type of world order power broker the ideologues deplore and government officials don't employ as speechwriters. He recognizes a Soviet claim to its own sphere of influence. Rollback is too dangerous an assault on the post-World War II order. In a piece bluntly titled Trading Poland for the Gulf, Tucker argues, the crises in Poland and the Persian Gulf invite comparison not only because in both instances the vital interests of a superpower are at stake but also because in both instances force may have to be employed against movements that enjoy undoubted legitimacy. In both Poland and the Persian Gulf, says Tucker, the issue today is above all one of order, not of justice. 9. In contrast to the Persian Gulf, Central America is a case of want. Tucker argued that it has no vital resources which make it a legitimate security concern worth the risks of intervention. As Tucker put it, We have now passed the period of overthrowing an Arbans in Guatemala, when disposing of governments to which we took offense was a quite easy undertaking to degree as Tucker saw it then. The only vital interest in Central America was to prevent the Soviets from developing military relations with Nicaragua or other countries along the lines of Cuba. Otherwise, radical regimes can be tolerated, assuming they can be co-opted through good relations with the U.S. Cost-benefit containment depends upon shared criteria of vital interests. But there is no consensus about what comprises need. In the case of natural resources, for example, if oil is the vital resource which gives the U.S. a license to intervene in the Middle East, then what about oil in Mexico and the Caribbean? Where some downplay the strategic importance of southern Africa, others point to its uranium, cobalt, and other resources and call it the Persian Gulf of minerals. Even on the Middle East, the consensus is not solid. Neoliberal leader Gary Hart registers his emphatic dissent from the Pentagon priority objective of ensuring access to the oil in Southwest Asia, calling such war preparation a disgrace to our national honor. Hart asserts, "We never should be reduced to shedding the blood of a single American in an unnecessary war for someone else's oil. It would be futile anyway," he says, "given the vulnerability of oil wells and tankers to sabotage and attack. Instead of relying on the rapid deployment force to keep O11 coming from the Middle East," says Hart, "we need an energy policy that will keep us from sending the RDF after oil." Unfortunately, Hart is an enthusiastic military reformer who contributes more ideas to the streamlining and strengthening of U.S. intervention forces, especially the restoration of United States naval superiority, than he does to the development of alternatives to military intervention. Cost-benefit containment becomes even muddier when other political military considerations are assessed. Regarding Central America, Michael Barnes, neoliberal chairman of the House Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs and senior counselor to the Kissinger Commission, says, "The only vital interest of the United States in Central America that most Americans would appear to agree on is the interest in preventing the emplacement of outside military capabilities in the region that could directly threaten the United States." In a paper for CSIS, Henry Kissinger advocates priorities in U.S. policy, but negates this with his challenge to those who doubt Central America is a vital interest. Which responsible national leader can risk that experiment? If it is vital, and we make an effort, we may have wasted some resources. But if we think it isn't vital and are wrong, we will not have a chance for another experiment. 24. The credibility quagmire. Alan Tonelson, associate editor of Foreign Policy, observes, U.S. foreign policy from 1945 through the mid-1970s was based largely on doctrines and theories, such as the Truman Doctrine, the containment theory and the domino theory, that explicitly held that challenges to America's interests could not be seen in isolation. In an extreme statement of this view, President Reagan declared in his April 1983 address to Congress that if the U.S. cannot defend itself in Central America, we cannot expect to prevail elsewhere. Our credibility would collapse, our alliances would crumble, and the safety of our homeland would be put to jeopardy. In 1980, Robert Tucker had played down the importance of intangible credibility, saying the eagle that kills the deer in Central America will not frighten the bear in the Middle East. By 1983, however, Tucker gave added significance to the credibility factor. Although the sky will not fail if we do not prevail in Central America, our defeat there may well entail serious consequences for our broader security interests elsewhere. It is not the safety of shipping lanes, or the prospects of a flood of refugees to this country, or the danger held out to the stability of Mexico that is ultimately at stake in Central America, it is the credibility of United States power registered. The real concern is far broader than the credibility of U.S. power vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It is the credibility of U.S. power in preserving U.S. dominance over the world economy. On El Salvador, Tucker rejected the simple choice between a revolutionary victory and a U.S. military victory, and pointed to the possibility of a third option, commonly known as power sharing, through which radical sectors could be incorporated into a government which accommodated U.S. concerns and thus preserved U.S. credibility. On Nicaragua, he offered only ambiguity. Tonelson recalls a lesson from King Frederick the Great: he who seeks to defend everything ultimately defends nothing. Besides North America, Western Europe, Japan, and the Persian Gulf, priorities would include South Korea, an important cog in the world economy, whose security directly affects Japan's, and Egypt, which has won the right to large amounts of U.S. aid with its post-1977 Middle East diplomacy and its willingness to permit Washington to use Egyptian military facilities to support U.S. fighting forces in the event of a Persian Gulf crisis. Although Tonelson argues there is hardly any security justification at present for extensive U.S. military or political engagement in the affairs of sub-Saharan Africa, the South and Southeastern Pacific, or Latin America, excluding, for example, the establishment of a Soviet military base or a local threat to the Panama Canal, there are many important cogs in the world economy whose security is perceived to affect the U.S. or its allies as much as South Korea. Point 2. The lesson for us is that neo-interventionists who seek to defend different priorities differently are locked into a policy quagmire. They can agree more easily upon when to intervene militarily, than when not to. The relevant policy spectrum. 25. Liberal containment. Advocates of liberal containment are the doves in today's establishment spectrum. They want containment with minimal confrontation with the Soviet Union and maximum accommodation to third world change. Most convinced of the correctness of the early trilateralist approach, they emphasize the use of reform to preempt or co-opt revolution and preserve Western dominance in its more subtle neocolonial form. When it comes to nuclear policy, liberals advocate nuclear arms reductions, limits on space weaponry, support for a comprehensive test ban treaty, and progress toward a no first-use position. As the nuclear weapons freeze gained public support, prominent liberals such as Ted Kennedy became active sponsors. Many liberal interventionists championed the freeze, only to undermine it with their support for destabilizing weapons such as the Trident, Cruise, and Pershing II missiles. Moreover, most establishment supporters of the freeze, liberals and non-liberals alike, would apply their nuclear divestments to the conventional war portfolio. Robert Legvold, formerly director of the CFR's Soviet project, set forth a liberal containment approach in a 1980 article titled "Containment Without Confrontation." Legvold argued that an effective Soviet policy must proceed on two tracks. One of firmness, military strength, and a will to act, the other of cooperation, the extended hand and a renewed interest in dealing with problems jointly rather than in turning problems against each other. More specifically, the latter track emphasizes arms control as central to national security policy and calls for cooperation in economic policy and a serious attempt to open the one area of détente that never got started, namely, crisis management. The military track calls for a reinstated draft, real progress on NATO's long-term defense program, an effective rapid deployment force and, as lesser priorities, a solution to the vulnerability of land-based intercontinental missiles and a response to new Soviet theater nuclear weapons, as well as the strengthening of U.S. military power in the Persian Gulf. Legvold's containment without confrontation position is hardly non-confrontationalist. Like most strategists in the politically relevant spectrum, he supports military assistance to the Afghan resistance to draw the line against such Soviet interventions in the future. He posed a set of rhetorical questions on the nature of U.S. intervention, which unfortunately went unanswered. What realistic limits are Americans shooting for? The United States will seek to deter further Afghanistan's, obviously that is, no more military invasions to make or save Revolutions presumably as well, any further joint Soviet-Cuban expeditions to force the outcome in fluid settings such as Angola are unacceptable. But will Americans oppose support for so-called freedom fighters such as the Patriotic Front in pre-independent Zimbabwe, or intriguing with groups such as the Sandinistas in Nicaragua? Will U.S. policy oppose Soviet intervention even where, in effect, international norms are being upheld, as in the Horn of Africa? Registered. 26. Like Tucker's rule of need vs. want, Legvold's questions suggest criteria which even interventionists debate. Take the issue of international norms. Some would argue, as African leaders do, that Cuban support for the Angolan government does adhere to international norms. Angola's MPLA government, widely recognized as legitimate by countries other than the United States, not to mention by the U.S. oil companies which are heavily invested there, invited Cuban forces to help them resist a South African invasion force which threatened to reach the capital. Does the obvious criteria that the U.S. will seek to deter further Afghanistans mean that the U.S. would actively block a Soviet intervention in Poland, part of its sphere of influence? Does it mean the U.S. forgoes the right to intervene in its sphere of influence to make or save pro-Western capitalist regimes faced with popular rebellion? There is a double standard. Of course, the Soviet Union would have no right to deter further El Salvadors, in the U.S. sphere of influence. The U.S. Soviet panel of the United Nations Association of the USA calls for a strategy similar to Legvold's. The panel warns that dynamic indigenous forces for change, such as Islamic nationalism in the Near East, decolonization in Africa and political radicalization in Central America, continue to develop largely beyond Soviet and American control. A successful U.S. policy. Ronald Reagan to a Chinese trained. Wants to give aid. Guerrilla. To make ATRACKS copyright phase Y, at the request of on U.S. owned which are guarded the Marxist Angolan equals wants, the support oil refineries. By Cuban troops. G60 Vernment. Of the U.S. people. Dan Wasserman. The relevant policy spectrum AE. Requires distinguishing between leftist regimes whose behavior is inimical to Western interests and those with parallel interests, between Soviet-aided but indigenously controlled movements and Soviet-dominated forces lacking genuine roots in the local society, and, finally, between pro-Western regimes whose stable and responsive governments make them potentially reliable partners and those whose days are numbered because they are out of touch with the needs of their own people. 9. Unfortunately, no examples are given. What would the USA panel recommend if an indigenous revolution threatened to bring down the current Saudi regime? The panel clearly supports intervention in some cases in the Third World. It singled out the readiness of conventional armed forces to carry out missions around the world as the most important and pervasive weakness in the U.S. military posture. The familiar key is rapid deployment. In the 1980s, a decade likely to be characterized by sudden and unpredictable events affecting U.S. interests in distant parts of the world, U.S. forces should be flexible and mobile. Accommodation in South Africa. An accommodationist program for South Africa was proposed in the lengthy May 1981 report, South Africa, Time Running Out. The report was prepared by an independent study commission on U.S. policy toward Southern Africa, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation and chaired by Ford Foundation President Franklin Thomas. Events have outpaced Time Running Out, but its recommendations posed a distinct alternative to the Reagan brand of constructive engagement and illustrate the parameters of accommodation. According to the Commission, the U.S. has the following basic interests in South Africa. 1. Protecting U.S. military and strategic interests and minimizing Soviet influence in Southern Africa. 2. Ensuring adequate supplies of key minerals imported from South Africa. 3. Advancing political freedom and civil liberties for all South Africans. 4. Maintaining satisfactory diplomatic and commercial relations with other African countries. 5. Maintaining commercial relations with South Africa *degree. Not surprisingly, the Commission rejected economic disinvestment. It suggested that U.S. corporations and financial institutions operating in South Africa should commit themselves to a policy of non-expansion and those businesses not already there should not enter the country. A generous proportion of corporate resources determined in accordance with a specific social development expenditure standard should be set aside to improve the lives of black South Africans. Also, U.S. companies that have not yet subscribed to the Sullivan Principles should do so, and companies would be effectively monitored. While ruling out 28. Disinvestment and a trade embargo at that time, the Commission did note that trade embargoes and disinvestment remain legitimate instruments of policy for circumstances of widespread violence, massive repression, or civil war. Presumably, an administration following Commission policy would have endorsed a trade embargo sooner than Reagan was forced to. But, it is unlikely the Commission would have admitted the hypocrisy of the Sullivan Principles approach and endorsed comprehensive disinvestment. In contrast to the Reagan policy of constructive engagement, the Commission supported the exclusion of South Africa from full membership in the Western Community of Nations until blacks have obtained an effective share in political power, and unlike Reagan, the Commission would demonstrate that it does not accept the view that South Africa, under its white minority government, is a bulwark against communism. Rather, it sees apartheid as a target and an opportunity for the growth of communist influence in the region. The Commission advocated broadening the arms embargo to cover foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies as well as broadening the embargo on nuclear collaboration with South Africa. In the Commission's view, the choice in South Africa was not between slow peaceful change and quick violent change, but between a slow, uneven, sporadically violent evolutionary process and a slow but much more violent descent into civil war. The report depicted two scenarios to illuminate this choice, noting they are not mutually exclusive. In the first scenario, Pretoria is both reformist and careful to select its targets for repression. The pattern would probably be one of increasingly forceful black demands, cautious and limited white concessions, increased black capabilities, more black demands, more white concessions, and so on, until a new, more just and more viable political order emerged. Eventually, whites would see it in their interest to concede some of their power, and blacks would regard it in their interest to not demand all of it. The premise is that the African National Congress's campaign would be contained, the ANC would not become a viable political force, and a multiracial government would emerge, probably with a federal structure allowing much local autonomy. In the second scenario, the hardline Afrikaners block government reforms, guerrilla struggle and nonviolent forms of struggle escalate, repression is more sweeping, attempts to co-opt black moderates go on, but the liberation movements acquire more popular legitimacy. The Soviet Union and Cuba cautiously increase their support for liberation forces, but Western nations are restrained by domestic and international politics from supporting Pretoria's reactionary policy. South Africa uses economic pressure and military raids against the neighboring frontline states, and the United Nations imposes some form of mandatory economic sanctions. In the end, says the report, the South African government's belief in victory would collapse, leading to de facto. The relevant policy spectrum 29. Partition or a Zimbabwean type of power-sharing arrangement. The Commission preferred the former scenario, but the US could live with the latter one because even though the ANC's role in the liberation struggle would earn it a place in a post-Civil War government, South Africa would probably continue to export minerals to the West, its natural market, and however close such a government became with the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Cuba, it would probably not compromise its hard-won sovereignty by granting the Soviet Union military base rights. 3. In the foreword to the new edition of Time Running Out, Franklin Thomas applauds the heightened awareness about South Africa in the United States and praises a growing commitment of the South African business community to an equitable society. He advocates negotiations which would preempt the radicalization of younger black leaders, on the one hand, and Afrikaner intransigence on the other. The last, best hope for a peaceful reconstruction of governance, says Thomas, lies in restoring legitimacy to those leaders suppressed in the past, notably ANC leader Nelson Mandela. Accommodation in Central America. On Central America, the accommodationist approach is being promoted by the Inter-American Dialogue, a group of political, academic, business, labor and religious leaders from the US, Canada, Latin America, and the Caribbean who have been meeting since 1982. The dialogue's co-chairs are Sol Lenowitz, chief negotiator for the Panama Canal Treaties and former U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States, and Gallo Plaza, formerly president of Ecuador and secretary general of the OAS. Among the dialogue members from the United States are Franklin Thomas, Cyrus Vance, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, former Secretary of Defense Elliot Richardson, Time Inc. Chairman Ralph Davidson, University of Notre Dame President Theodore Hesburgh, IBM World Trade Americas Chairman Ralph Pfeiffer, Vice President of the Amalgamated Textile and Clothing Workers Union Joyce Miller, San Antonio Mayor Henry Cisneros and Rockefeller Foundation Chairman Clifton Wharton. In the second dialogue report, The Americas in 1984, A Year for Decisions, participants argue that the exaggeration of the East-West dimension to events in the regions has a self-fulfilling quality, for it escalates the level of superpower involvement and confrontation. It warns against a self-created credibility trap of drawing artificial lines that then need to be defended. Dialogue members assume that the US and other nations in the hemisphere have a security interest in keeping Soviet and Cuban combat forces and military bases out of Central America and in preventing Cuba and the Soviet Union from disrupting the sea lanes in and around the region. To disentangle Central America from the East-West conflict, reciprocal commitments should be sought regarding combat forces and military bases. The dialogue calls for support of the Contadora Initiative. In the context of a Contadora-backed regional accord, the US should make it clear to the Soviet Union that any attempt by the USSR to introduce combat forces, bases, offensive weapons, or strategic facilities into the Caribbean basin would be regarded as a serious provocation, calling for the measures necessary to prevent or reverse it. This dialogue report was written before the MiGs crisis of fall 1984 discussed in the next chapter. One can only presume that dialogue members do not mean this as a license to the Reagan administration to take out the MiGs if Nicaragua chooses to import them in the absence of a Contadora Accord and in the face of Contra warfare. Regarding Nicaragua, the U.S. should immediately end support for the military and paramilitary activities of the Contras they contend, although some of us think that past pressures may have influenced Nicaragua to be more conciliatory. We believe that further support for them is unjustifiable. It would be ineffective, counterproductive and, in the view of most of us, plain wrong. Written before the November 1984 Nicaraguan election, the report urged the Nicaraguan government and the relevant policy spectrum 31 opposition groups to lay the basis for truly fair, internationally observed elections. On El Salvador, says the report, the struggle must be moved from the battlefield to the political arena. Elections without prior negotiations among the belligerents are not enough. Elections alone do not make effective democracies, democracies make effective elections. The report also recommends that Cuba and the U.S. open a dialogue on Central America, relying first perhaps upon Contadora intermediaries. It may be that an opportunity exists for a mutually acceptable resolution of Cuban U.S. differences over Central America on the basis of a shared interest in de-escalating the conflict. Reagan Doctrine. Schultz vs. Weinberger. Within the Reagan administration, which Podhoretz and other rollbackers see as dominated in practice by advocates of moderate containment, there has been a public debate over guidelines for military intervention between Secretary of State Schultz and Secretary of Defense Weinberger. In a speech to the Trilateral Commission in April 1984, Schultz argued, "Over 20 years ago, President John Kennedy pledged that the United States would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and success of liberty. P. And remember, we're here to defend the national security of the United States. Roger. We know now that we are not omnipotent and that we must set priorities. We cannot pay any price or bear any burden. We must discriminate. We must respond in ways appropriate to the challenge and engage our power only when very important strategic stakes are involved." However, in a February 1985 speech to the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, Schultz committed U.S. support to the so-called democratic revolution sweeping the world, and praised the freedom fighters of Afghanistan, Cambodia, Ethiopia, Angola, Poland, and Nicaragua. Schultz has become increasingly outspoken in his calls for an active defense against terrorism directed at the U.S. and its allies. In an October 1984 speech, Schultz asserted, "We may never have the kind of evidence that can stand up in an American court of law. But we cannot allow ourselves to become the Hamlet of nations, worrying endlessly over whether and how to respond. Fighting terrorism will not be a clean or pleasant contest, but we have no choice but to play tease. Weinberger's pivotal speech in the intervention debate was his November 28, 1984 address to the National Press Club, in which he spelled out 6 tests for the commitment of U.S. troops. The stakes should be vital, there should be a clear intention of winning, the forces should be commensurate with clearly defined political and military objectives, there should be some reasonable assurance of popular and congressional support, and U.S. forces should be a last resort. Weinberger's concern about winnability as a primary determinant of U.S. military intervention is not new. During his 1980 confirmation hearings, Weinberger reflected on the lessons of the Vietnam War and asserted that the U.S. should not commit troops to a war that is not vital for our national security to enter, and we should never enter a war that we do not intend to win or in which we do not expend every single effort of every weapon and every facility that we have to win. Once we entered it, it became a war that we should have 1 degree registered. Weinberger's overwhelming priority is to keep the U.S. military buildup on track. From the beginning, he has cautioned against fueling public and congressional opposition with direct, massive military intervention anywhere it was not cheap and quick. This has meant a yellow then green light on Grenada, a red light on Lebanon and a yellow light on Nicaragua and El Salvador. In Central America, the yellow light is edging toward green as the infrastructure for military intervention is solidified, public pretexts for intervention are consolidated and options fade. This does not mean, as has often been asserted, that state and defense have reversed roles, with Weinberger acting more like a dove and Schultz acting more like a hawk. That view is misleading. For example, Weinberger is a staunch opponent of arms control agreements with the Soviet Union while Schultz is an advocate of flexible negotiations. Weinberger unequivocally supports the overthrow of the Nicaraguan government while, at least until the latter part of 1985, Schultz attempted to find space in the administration for a possible political settlement. Gamble. Weinberger resisted Schultz's view that Marcos was a liability until there was near unanimous support in Congress and the administration for the failing dictator's removal. The goal of Weinberger's military program is to consolidate the ability of the United States to unilaterally wage global war and win. Weinberger's relentless military buildup, to use a term normally reserved for the Soviets, includes expanded special forces for counterinsurgency, a 600-ship navy for modern gunboat diplomacy, deployment of first-strike nuclear weapons such as the cruise missile and development of Star Wars to shield the U.S. from Soviet retaliation after a U.S. first strike. Continued naval superiority would allow the U.S. to control the sea lanes and discard the so-called 1.5 or 2.5 war strategies for a multi-theater or global war strategy which envisions protracted conventional wars in the Third World, lasting many years, and simultaneous warfare with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union only launched their first full-scale aircraft carrier in 1986 and has begun building a second. The first carrier, capable of launching some types of fighter planes, will not be fully operational for another 10 years. 8 The integrated conventional nuclear battlefield would span the globe. The US would confront the Soviets with vertical escalation, escalating from conventional to nuclear war, and horizontal escalation, attacking not just in the immediate conflict area, but anywhere in the world where the US perceives an advantage. A U.S.-Soviet clash in the Middle East, for example, might bring on a US strike against Cuba. Low-intensity conflict. Behind the ongoing Schultz-Weinberger debate is a consensus within the Reagan administration about the preferred mode of military intervention, the so-called low-intensity conflict doctrine. Low-intensity conflict includes guerrilla warfare, terrorism, coups, revolution. 34. Border skirmishes, civil war, and counterinsurgency campaigns short of full-scale war. Military analyst Michael Clare explains that the LIC designation applies to the current level of fighting in Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, Lebanon, the Philippines, and Central America. According to Pentagon strategists, notes Clare, the Vietnam War fell into the LIC category for most of its duration, though with the massive U.S. air attacks on the north and the invasion of Cambodia, it escalated to a higher level, to mid-intensity conflict. 9 The Heritage Foundation report, Mandate for Leadership 2, describes Reagan administration initiatives in the three basic areas of low-intensity warfare. 1. Countering Marxist insurgencies against friendly governments. The U.S. Army is Special Operations Command and the Joint Chiefs of Staff Special Operations Agency were established to respond to low-intensity threats, especially those requiring a counterinsurgency strategy. 2. Assisting pro-Western insurgencies against Marxist regimes. Paramilitary assets of the CIA have been expanded to assist insurgents challenging Soviet-backed regimes. And 3. Negating the threat of terrorism. Important initiatives have been undertaken. Presidential National Security Decision Directive 138 ordered the appropriate agencies to develop an offensively focused anti-terrorist capability. *degree. The Heritage Report recommends that the Reagan administration establish a special group to oversee LIC within the National Security Council, and advocates continued or new aid to insurgencies in Cambodia, Angola, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Laos, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Iran, and Libya. While LIC is the preferred form of military intervention, it is not necessarily a viable strategy for the long run. Precisely because the freedom fighters are often more popular in Washington than in their homelands, they have little chance of taking power without more massive U.S. military intervention. LIC is a war of attrition, designed not for rapid overthrow of the targeted regime, but slow-motion destabilization, first of the progressive program, eventually of the enemy government itself. But it is unlikely that the U.S. will sustain multiple, perpetual wars of attrition without ever committing its own forces in an attempt to win. Too much credibility will be at stake in too many places. Too many doors to escalation, planned or unplanned, will lie open. At some point, the U.S. may decide that the target regime has been softened up sufficiently to go for an invasion. The prevailing administration assessment of military involvement in Nicaragua is that the U.S. could quickly and easily rout the Sandinistas. In the words of an important intelligence official, it would be like falling off a log. Attrition works both ways. To use the language of the relevant spectrum, Congress may tire of a seemingly no-win conflict and force a choice between cutting losses and getting out unilaterally or through negotiations and making a commitment to win. After 6 years of LIC in Nicaragua, the U.S. has not reached this crossroads, but it is looming nearer. It is to the Nicaraguan example we now turn. At Mr. N. The Nicaragua example. To those imprisoned in regimes held captive, to those beaten for daring to fight for freedom and democracy, for their right to worship, to speak, to live, and prosper in the family of free nations, we say to you tonight, you are not alone, freedom fighters. America will support with moral and material assistance your right not just to fight and die for freedom, but to fight and win freedom in Afghanistan, Angola, Cambodia, and Nicaragua. This is a great moral challenge for the entire free world. Surely, no issue is more important for peace in our own hemisphere, for the security of our frontiers, for the protection of our vital interests than to achieve democracy in Nicaragua and to protect Nicaragua's democratic neighbors. President Reagan, State of the Union, 1986. We're proud to be Nicaraguans. This revolution transcends national boundaries. Our revolution has always been internationalist, ever since Sandino fought in the Segovias. This does not mean that we export our revolution. It's enough and we couldn't do otherwise for us to export our example, the example of the courage, sensitivity, and determination of our people. How could we not be upset about the injustices that are committed in different parts of the world? But we know that it is the people themselves of these countries who must make their revolution, and we know that by advancing our revolution we are also helping our brothers and sisters in the rest of Latin America. Tomás Borga, the second anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, July 19, 1981. Following the 1984 vice presidential debate, George Bush's press secretary told reporters, "You can say anything you want in a debate, and 80 million people hear it." If reporters then document that a candidate spoke untruthfully, so what? Maybe 200 people read it, or 2,000 or 20,000. 2. 36. The press secretary knows that it's the immediate impact that really counts, not the finer print debates which may follow. Reporters, Congress, and the public tend to believe first or act like they do and doubt later, no matter how often the untruths are documented. If a rebuttal is forthcoming in the media, it generally gets far less coverage than the initial headline story, mainly in print, off the front page, with little or nothing on network evening news. The Reagan media strategists, says Jack Nelson of the Los Angeles Times, realize that the first impressions are lasting impressions. That's part of their public relations genius. Grenada, he says, is the perfect example. There are still people who think that place was crawling with armed Cubans. It doesn't matter how often you go back and say that the fact is there were only 500 or 600 Cubans, that you got the truth out of Havana and lies out of Washington, people just say, "Ah, that's just the press." What's more, the rebuttals are often systematically forgotten in future stories which regurgitate the official line, e.g. the U.S. invaded Grenada at the behest of other Caribbean nations concerned about their security, rescued American students and liberated the Grenadine people. If any doubts remain about U.S. justifications for invading, no matter, the Grenadine people love us for it. In the words of a New York Times editorial, on the occasion of Reagan's February 20, 1986 visit to the island, America's political conduct since then has been wholly admirable and, notwithstanding the island's grave economic problems which the U.S. will paternalistically help solve, Reagan, America's conquering hero, deserves to revel in some merited acclaim. Have the greatest admiration for your propaganda. Propaganda in the West is carried on by experts who have had the best training in the world in the field of advertising and have mastered the techniques with exceptional proficiency. Yours are subtle and persuasive, ours are crude and obvious. Think that the fundamental difference between our worlds, with respect to propaganda, is quite simple. You tend to believe yours, and we tend to disbelieve ours. A Soviet correspondent, based 5 years in the United States, quoted by Farley Mowat in The Siberians. On propaganda. It's bizarre. David Horsey. Ronald Reagan is a great communicator largely because he understands that you can say anything you want and, even better, show anything you want in a carefully staged photo opportunity, and, if reporters then document that spoke untruthfully, so what? Indeed, Reagan's special charm is that the more he misspeaks, the less his misstatements affect his credibility. Sometimes Reagan misspeaks out of ignorance, other times on purpose. The latter is disinformation. Disinformation works best when the media and the public have historical amnesia, short attention spans, ethnocentric educations and an ideological predisposition to believe presidential propaganda. The beauty of disinformation is that the more people are already disinformed, the more receptive they are to being further disinformed. I make one parallel here with the Vietnam War. When J. William Fulbright, the former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who changed from being a supporter of the war to a leading critic, was asked to comment on the lessons of Vietnam, he replied, not to trust government statements referring to government statements on Vietnam and Central America. Fulbright added, they fit the facts to fit the policy. We made a great mistake in Vietnam and are making another one in Central America *, so it goes with Nicaragua. Fitting the facts to fit the policy of intervention. President Reagan has called Nicaragua a totalitarian dungeon. The Sandinistas are infinitely worse than Somoza, he says. He has branded Nicaragua an outlaw state, part of a confederation of terrorist states, also including Iran, Libya, North Korea, and Cuba. He told the American Bar Association these outlaw states were run by the strangest collection of misfits, Looney Tunes and squalid criminals since the advent of the Third Reich. The esteemed lawyers laughed and applauded loudly. Registered. The formerly more reserved George Shultz has taken to referring to the Nicaraguan government as a cancer. Right here on our land mass. Registered. Nicaragua is our piece of real estate. The Sandinistas are trespassing, the penalty is vilification and death. 38. America's Watch, an internationally respected human rights organization, comments on Reagan policy toward Nicaragua. it may well be that this tiny country of fewer than 3 million people has been the target of more criticism on human rights grounds from the Reagan administration and especially from the president himself than any other country in the world. More than South Africa, more than Turkey, more than Chile, maybe even more than the so-called evil empire, the Soviet Union itself. In a report analyzing Reagan rhetoric and reality, America's Watch says the description of a totalitarian state bears no resemblance to Nicaragua in 1985. In Nicaragua there is no systematic practice of forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, or torture as has been the case with the friendly armed forces of El Salvador. While prior censorship has been imposed by emergency legislation, debate on major social-political questions is robust, outspoken, even often strident. The November 1984 elections, though deficient, were a democratic advance over the past 5 years of Nicaraguan history and compare favorably with those of El Salvador and Guatemala. Moreover, some notable reductions in abuses have occurred in Nicaragua since 1982, despite the pressure caused by escalating external attacks registered. The right to intervene. The debate over Nicaragua has become more and more one-sided. In Congress, the question isn't whether to intervene in Nicaragua, but how best to intervene. The conservatives yell, "They're the devil." With few exceptions, the liberals respond, "They're devilish," but the typical but centers upon the concern that the Contras can't succeed. An editorial in the February 13, 1985 New York Times illustrates this point well. I quote it at length because it epitomizes the narrowness of the debate and the arrogance of U.S. policy, even in its accommodationist form. President Reagan has given interviewers from the Times a clear, concise statement of his attitude toward the Sandinista rulers of Nicaragua. They betrayed the revolution that Americans cheered for its promise of democracy, he said. They have become pro-Soviet, chased Democrats into exile and refused to subject their power to the consent of the Nicaraguan people. The exile army of Contras, therefore, has every reason to fight for democracy. The United States has ample reason to help them. The president's premises are admirable and accurate. But his attitude is not a policy. Why not? First, because the costs of exporting democracy by war are usually too high. A second reason is that we're rotten at making intrusive war, overtly or covertly. The Sandinistas and Fidel Castro are good examples of how rotten. Their regimes result directly from dictatorships sponsored by America's Marines or meddling diplomats. A third reason is more abstract but no less compelling. Americans don't want to live in a world where nations feel free to impose their political doctrines on others by force. War should be a last resort, to defend vital national interests. The American-sponsored Contra Army is simply too weak to overthrow the Sandinistas. Its hit-and-run assaults can damage their economy and punish their hostility. But such warfare also invites either unthinkable escalation or the ultimate humiliation of failing to achieve our stated purpose. Meanwhile the combat cruelly 39. Exploits Nicaraguan patriots whose goal we know to be unattainable. Sol, couldn't the Contra Army hurt the Sandinistas enough to make them willing to deal? Perhaps, if the price were clear to them, and tolerable, what they might do under pressure is agree to bar Soviet and Cuban military bases and to let an inter-American force guard against arms shipments to El Salvador. What then of the political, religious and labor freedoms that the President and all Americans want to see in Nicaragua? As in dealing with other countries, these could be made the price of real friendship, of aid, and trade concessions. The policy choices in Nicaragua are not between blind force and abject acquiescence. Geography and circumstance create an American interest in Nicaragua's future and opportunities to influence it. Surely judicious pressures for negotiable ends promise a better result than aimless combat. At worst, the Nicaraguan people would be left in a grim peace. At best, they would have America to thank for a gradual improvement in their condition. The U.S. is making war on Nicaragua. It is a bloody war, not a war of abstract pressures and punishments to make the Sandinistas cry uncle, as if the Nicaraguan people were so many arms to be twisted behind their government's back. By better understanding this war and the debate which attends it, we can work more effectively to end the war and challenge the interventionist logic which supports it. I want to make 2 points at the outset. First, U.S. intervention in Nicaragua is the rule, not the exception. It is not a reluctant response to alleged Sandinista aggression. It has been going on long before the Sandinistas and the Somozas. Moreover, this intervention conforms to an unbroken pattern of U.S. intervention to destabilize all genuinely progressive governments in the hemisphere and much of the world. To say that Nicaraguans are provoking U.S. intervention is like saying women provoke rape. Second, the outcome the U.S. fears most in Nicaragua is not a so-called Cuban-style Soviet colony, but a non-aligned, democratic government which delivers on its promises of social justice. Why? Because if it could happen in Nicaragua, it could happen elsewhere, presenting a cumulative challenge to U.S. dominance of Latin America, the Caribbean, and the global economy. A Nicaraguan third way, neither Soviet-style, nor U.S. style, would undermine the Cold War logic which is used to justify U.S. intervention in the Third World and keep the Western Allies in line. In 1829, the Latin American liberator Simon Bolívar wrote that the United States seemed destined to plague America to misery in the name of liberty. For Nicaraguans, fear of a U.S. invasion is not rooted in paranoia, but in history. Indeed, according to Carl Berman, the 1910 overthrow of Nicaragua's nationalist liberal president Zelaya was the first occasion anywhere of U.S. intervention to remove an established government. Earlier, Nicaraguans saw the Tennessee adventurer and slavery advocate William Walker shoot his way into power in 1855 and receive diplomatic recognition from the U.S. In 1912, thousands of Marines came ashore to prop up the subservient government of Adolfo Diaz, of the Conservative Party. U.S. officials and bankers directly managed NICA. 40. Ragua's economy, foreign policy, and electoral frauds for the next decade. The Marines left in 1925, but were back again in 1927 to put down a liberal rebellion. The Russian Revolution of 1917 gave Washington a bogeyman to use in scaring up support for its well-worn policy of intervention. In the late 1920s, U.S. officials testified to Congress with supposed evidence of Bolshevist designs on Nicaragua and the Panama Canal. Mexico was then the Russian proxy in subversion. Secretary of State Frank Kellogg claimed that the Bolshevik leaders have had very definite ideas with respect to the role which Mexico and Latin America are to play in their general program of world revolution. Latin America and Mexico, he asserted, are conceived as a base for activity against the United States. Degree in 1927, Under-Secretary of State Robert Olds called Nicaragua a test case of U.S. prestige and resolve in a confidential and thus more candid memorandum. Selected U.S. military and CIA interventions 1898 to 1902, occupation of Cuba 1899 to 1902, Philippines 1901, acquires Puerto Rico 1906-09, occupation of Cuba 1909, Nicaragua, overthrow of Zelaya 1912 to 25, occupation of Nicaragua 1914, Mexico 1914 to 34, occupation of Haiti 1916 to 24, occupation of Dominican Republic 1917 to 23, occupation of Cuba 1919, occupation of Honduran ports 1926 to 33, occupation of Nicaragua 1947 to 49, Greece 1953, Iran, overthrow of Mossadegh 1954, Guatemala, overthrow of Arbenz 1958, Lebanon, Midway 1961, Bay of Pigs, invasion of Cuba 1945, 1961 to 75, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia 1964, Brazil, overthrow of Goulart 1965, Indonesia 1965 to 66, occupation of Dominican Republic 1973, Chile, overthrow of Allende Arrent 1974 to 76, Angola taken Hornspan 1979, El Salvador 1898, Pa. 1980, Nicaragua sh 1983, occupation of Grenada Marshals, BS 1985, Cambodia SE 1986, Angola The Central American area down to and including the Isthmus of Panama constitutes a legitimate sphere of influence for the United States. Our ministers accredited to the 5 little republics, stretching from the Mexican border to Panama, have been advisors whose advice has been accepted virtually as law in the capitals where they respectively reside. We do control the destinies of Central America, and we do so for the simple reason that the national interest absolutely dictates such a course. Until now, Central America has always understood that governments which we recognize and support stay in power, while those which we do not recognize and support fall. Nicaragua has become a test case. The 1928 Republican platform said the same thing in language more suited for public consumption. The United States has an especial interest in the advancement and progress of all the Latin American countries. The Marines, now in Nicaragua, are there to protect American lives and property and to aid in carrying out an agreement whereby we have undertaken to do what we can to restore and maintain order and ensure a free and fair election. Our policy absolutely repudiates any idea of conquest or exploitation, and is actuated solely by an earnest and sincere desire to assist a friendly and neighboring state which has appealed for aid in a great emergency. Nicaragua's national hero, Augusto Cesar Sandino, rebelled against manifest U.S. control of Central American destiny. He rejected the U.S. attempt to impose a Tweedledum two-party system on Nicaragua with the 1927 liberal-conservative peace settlement. Washington called him a bandit and an outlaw. Sandino's genuine freedom fighters raised enough sympathy and caused enough U.S. casualties to fuel an opposition movement in the United States to the Nicaragua intervention then being managed by President Coolidge. The U.S. decided on a longer-range plan to replace U.S. troops and build up the Nicaraguan National Guard. In 1932 Anastasio Somoza Garcia became the Guardia commander, and in 1933 the last U.S. Marines left Nicaragua after the U.S. orchestrated elections of 1932. Sandino signed a peace treaty with President Juan Sacasa, but tensions mounted with Somoza's National Guard, and in 1934 Sandino was assassinated. In 1936 Somoza staged a coup and began a family dictatorship that was to last until 1979 when the Sandinistas overthrew Anastasio Somoza, Jr. The intervention racket war is a racket. It may seem odd for me, a military man, to adopt such a comparison. Truthfulness compels me to. Spent 33 years and 4 months in active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps, and during the period spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. In short, was a racketeer for capitalism. Thus helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. Helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. Helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. Helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. Brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. Helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. Looking back on it, Feel might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 city districts. We Marines operated on 3 continents. Major General Smedley D. Butler, 2-time winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor. Forgotten gambits. There is a popular myth perpetuated by liberals and rollbackers alike which blames U.S. hostility on Sandinista duplicity toward a benevolent Carter administration. The story goes that Carter paved the Sandinista path to power by withdrawing support from Somoza and then welcomed them with open arms and aid in the first year after the revolution. The bad Sandinistas, we are told, bit the Carter administration hand that was feeding them by running guns for the Soviets to the Salvadoran revolutionaries. So goes the story. Here's the reality. By mid-1978, popular rebellion against Somoza had grown to the point that Carter officials felt there was no way to prevent a Sandinista victory and keep Somoza in power. As Robert Pastor, Carter's National Security Council advisor for Latin American and Caribbean affairs, explains, when the business sector shut down Managua for the second time in a general strike in August 1978 and the middle class lined the streets to cheer the Sandinistas as they were escorted to the airport after their takeover of the National Palace, it was clear that the people of Nicaragua had had enough with 40 years of Somoza rule. The U.S. began to pressure Somoza to resign in favor of a transitional regime which would keep the National Guard and the elite intact. This strategy was branded by Nicaraguans as Somocismo without Somoza. When the FSLN began a final offensive in May 1979, the Carter administration attempted to intervene with a so-called peacekeeping force under the auspices of the Organization of American States, which would allow a new government to be set up without FSLN participation. For the first time since its founding in 1948, the OAS rejected a U.S. proposal to intervene in the Americas. The U.S. continued trying, unsuccessfully, to arrange for a provisional government, first without any Sandinistas, then with a Sandinista minority. On July 17 Somoza resigned after Carter was forced to accept a Sandinista peace plan worked out with the OAS. The orderly transition plan went awry when Somoza's appointed caretaker attempted to stay in power. As the fighting continued, the National Guard disintegrated and on July 19, 1979 Sandinista fighters and supporters poured into Managua and the new government of national reconstruction took power. Carter's trilateralist fallback strategy from that point on was to rely on economic aid to bolster the more conservative forces in the Reconstruction government and help strengthen the private business sector. But the co-optation strategy never had a chance in the increasingly hardline political climate both inside and outside the Carter administration. Carter's aid package of $75 million targeted largely to Nicaraguan business, not the government, faced immediate opposition. 44. From conservative politicians. Congress tied the aid further to certification that Nicaragua was not aiding or abetting or supporting acts of violence or terrorism in other countries. Carter so certified in September 1980. But with guerrilla forces in El Salvador gaining ground, Nicaragua became the scapegoat for Carter administration frustration with its inability to control social change in Central America. In January 1981, just before leaving office, Carter suspended $15 million in undisbursed credits for Nicaragua, pending an investigation of Nicaragua's alleged role in supplying arms to the Salvadoran guerrillas, and cancelled authorization of negotiations for the renewal of Public Law 480 long-term, low-interest loans for the sale of wheat and cooking oil. 4. Contravention. For the Reagan administration, it wasn't a question of how to best support so-called moderates in the Sandinista government, but how to overthrow that government. The 1980 Republican platform stated, "We deplore the Marxist-Sandinista takeover of Nicaragua and the attempts to destabilize El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We oppose the Carter administration aid program for the government of Nicaragua. However, we will support the efforts of the Nicaraguan people to establish a free and independent government. We will return to the fundamental principle of treating a friend as a friend and self-proclaimed enemies as enemies, without apology." At about this time, Business International Corporation issued a forecast on Nicaragua which said the Sandinista leadership seems to be gravitating toward a relatively moderate course, i.e. a course which indicated a significant role for the Nicaraguan private sector and international business and banking. Registered Nicaragua wasn't playing its assigned role of totalitarian threat. So the self-fulfilling prophecy of creating an enemy of Nicaragua went into effect. The Reagan administration began a sophisticated disinformation campaign to win support for its as yet unpublicized goal of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government. The first critical phase of the disinformation campaign was the 1981 State Department White Paper, titled Communist Interference in El Salvador. It pretended to show a Soviet plan, based on captured documents, to arm Salvadoran rebels via Nicaragua and establish a communist base. In following months, the white paper was thoroughly discredited in reports in the mainstream and alternative press. Some documents were revealed as forgeries and genuine ones did not support U.S. charges. In June 1984, The administration's transparent case was further damaged when David McMichael, a CIA intelligence analyst from 1981 to 1983, charged that the administration and the CIA have systematically misrepresented Nicaraguan involvement in the supply of arms to Salvadoran guerrillas to justify its efforts to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. There have been no verified reports of arms. 45. Shipments from Nicaragua to El Salvador since April 1981.16, but the original charge that Nicaragua is exporting revolution has stuck even in the media, which showed it to be false. There has been no lack of verified reports of US aid to the Contras. By 1980, former National Guardsmen had begun reorganizing in camps along the Honduran border with Nicaragua and in Florida. They were aided by Cuban exiles and agents of the Argentine military dictatorship then in power. By 1981, the Florida camps were receiving increased attention in the press. Although the Nicaraguans boasted of their goal of overthrowing the Sandinistas, the U.S. government never took any action to enforce the Neutrality Act prohibiting private groups from making war preparations against a foreign government. In December 1981, President Reagan signed a secret directive authorizing an initial expenditure of $19 million to conduct paramilitary operations against Nicaragua. Congressional intelligence committees were told that the purpose of the aid was to interdict arms allegedly being supplied by Nicaragua to the Salvadoran rebels. How anyone could believe, or even pretend to believe, such an absurd rationale is beyond me. Imagine thinking that Nicaraguan National Guardsmen were willing to risk their lives as U.S. mercenaries, not to avenge their defeat and attempt to retake power, but simply to stop arms from going to a third country, El Salvador. A member of the Reagan administration core group, which ran the then-secret war, told reporter Christopher Dickey that if the Intelligence Committee members didn't understand the CIA program, it was a trumped-up misunderstanding. It would. MK. Casey, what are you really? We're just trying to stop the flow of arms to El Salvador up to in Nicaragua. The Contras you fund say they're out to equals that / would stop tide flow, overthrow the Nicaraguan government of arms. Dan Wasserman. 46. Have defied logic for anyone to think that the sole purpose of an anti-Sandinista soldier was to intercept arms traveling down a trail. As the secret war became an increasingly public one, the arms interdiction rationale was superseded by more grandiose claims. Now the US was supporting freedom fighters and countering a threat which Soviet-backed Nicaragua posed to wholesome democracies like El Salvador and to US security. The disinformation campaign moved into higher gear as public opinion polls showed strong opposition to U.S. action to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, and the Congress showed some sense and passed the 1982 Boland Amendment. It prohibited U.S. activity aimed at overthrowing the government of Nicaragua or provoking a military exchange between Nicaragua and Honduras. The Reagan administration contravened the Boland Amendment and kept on escalating the war with congressional acquiescence in practice, if not on paper. In 1983, the Reagan administration established a Ministry of Truth called the White House Outreach Working Group on Central America. Together with the State Department's Office of Public Diplomacy, it instituted a perception management program to better disinform the public, especially opinion makers in politics, the media, academia, business, and labor. Pretexts. We must prevent consolidation of a Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. If we cannot prevent that, we have to anticipate the partition of Central America. Such a development would then force us to man a new military front line of the East-West conflict, right here on our continent. Undersecretary of Defense Fred Ickel, September 1983. The disinformation campaign embraces 4 basic administration positions on Nicaragua. Nicaragua is engaged in a massive military buildup serving the Soviet Union and threatening U.S. security. Nicaragua's November 4, 1984 elections were a farce. Nicaragua has rejected our repeated peace efforts. The forces fighting the Nicaraguan government are freedom fighters, committed to democracy. 8. Threat to U.S. security. Nicaragua is said to be engaged in a massive Soviet-sponsored military buildup which threatens U.S. security. This position was consolidated during the November 1984 MiG scare, which diffused concern over the CIA-Contra manual and allowed the Nicaraguan elections to be more easily, wrongly dismissed as a Soviet-style sham. The climate for congressional renewal of aid to the Contras was improved, and a pretext for future escalation of U.S. intervention in Nicaragua proved its bipartisan merit. There was widespread congressional support for the administration position that military action would be justified to destroy advanced fighter aircraft delivered to Nicaragua. 47. As doubt grew about the MiG's arrival, administration officials shifted attention to Nicaragua's overall military capability, as seen through Cold War lenses which filtered out the U.S.-backed Contra War as a factor. On November 10, 1984, Secretary of State George Shultz said, "The Nicaraguans seem intent on militarizing their society and accumulating a level of weapons and armed capability that is entirely outside the standpoint of any conceivable defensive mission." Defense Department spokesman Michael Birch asserted, "We just don't feel that Nicaragua wants to be a peaceful neighbor." In early 1980, as Contra attacks were already underway, the State Department and Pentagon gave this assessment of the Nicaraguan military. To an even greater degree than other elements of government, the Nicaraguan defense establishment was swept away. Nothing remains except for some small arms and the battered remnants of other equipment, all of it battle-scarred and most of it fit for little more than salvage. The armed forces of Nicaragua must be entirely rebuilt, both its personnel and equipment. 9. Nicaragua's first choice for arms was the United States, but the Carter administration responded negatively. West European countries were approached, and after François Mitterrand was elected in May 1981, France negotiated a small weapons sale to Nicaragua. The US cried stab in the back and turned up the heat until France changed course and agreed to subject the weapons deliveries to indefinite delays. NACLA writer Robert Matthews observes, France, with the world's third-largest arms export industry, a popular new left-wing government and a history of relative independence from Washington, proved unable to fulfill Nicaragua's hopes of Western arms supplies. For the Sandinistas, the lesson was clear. Henceforth, Nicaraguan diplomacy, trade and aid initiatives would have to factor in the Soviet bloc's exclusive role as a supplier of Nicaragua's defense needs, which escalated rapidly as Washington's preference for a military solution became ever more apparent. Degree. As Nicaragua followed the only path open in the face of a US-sponsored arms embargo, and turned increasingly to the Soviet Union for military assistance, the Reaganauts stepped up their charge that Nicaragua was being built up by the Soviets as a base for subversion of the Western Hemisphere. The administration has published numerous reports on the alleged Soviet military buildup in Nicaragua. Like the 1981 White Paper on El Salvador, they don't make their case, but they do scare people. The joint March 1985 State and Defense Department booklet, The Soviet-Cuban Connection in Central America and the Caribbean, devotes a whole page to grainy photos of President Daniel Ortega on official visits to the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Poland. Was the Reagan-Gorbachev smiling summit part of a commie plot to commit subversion through photo opportunities? 48. Even the hardcore alleged evidence looks foolish. On page 25 of the Soviet-Cuban Connection there's a chart showing the Pentagon's guesstimates of Soviet bloc military deliveries to Nicaragua. Never mind the fact that it measures in tons, and you don't need many trucks, tanks, or helicopters to make a lot of tons. The chart has the first jump in Soviet aid coming in 1982, 2 years after Contra attacks began, not before then, as Reagan rhetoric has it. Administration officials claim that Nicaragua has received more than $500 million in Soviet military aid since 1981. The most interesting point about that figure, undoubtedly inflated, is how small it is considering that Nicaraguan armed forces had to be entirely rebuilt and in comparison to U.S. military aid to Central America in the same period. In FY 1985, El Salvador was authorized by Congress over $128 million in military assistance, and Honduras, over $62 million, not counting assistance provided under presidential authority, supplemental assistance, reprogramming, and the cloak of military maneuvers. Moreover, a large part of security assistance is provided through economic support funds, of which El Salvador was authorized $195 million in 1985.2. According to the Caribbean Basin Information Project, the U.S. provided over $2.3 billion in security assistance to Central America between J980 and 1984.22. The most striking feature of Nicaragua's military buildup, says one analyst, is how its rhythm has responded to specific threats and acts of aggression. 5. Some U.S. military officials have admitted to reporters that Nicaragua's Soviet weapons, including attack helicopters, surface. Roger. The Nicaragua example. 49. To-air missiles and high-speed patrol boats, are primarily defensive. If Nicaragua imported MiGs or other advanced fighters, it would improve its ability to confront contra-air power and better match its neighbors. As of early 1985, the Nicaraguan Air Force included no supersonic fighters or fighter bombers and a total of 31 less advanced fighters, trainers, transport, and support craft, not including helicopters. In comparison, Honduras had 32 to 50 supersonic fighters and fighter bombers and 48 armed and unarmed trainers, transport, and support craft. El Salvador had 53 supersonic fighters and fighter bombers and 64 other aircraft, not including helicopters. Clearly, Nicaragua cannot match U.S. air power in or near the region. For example, the U.S. aircraft carrier, America, which has been involved in Atlantic and Caribbean maneuvers, has 85 aircraft. The idea of a Nicaragua attack on the Panama Canal, Mexico, or Texas is even more absurd than the idea that the Somocistas were fighting in Nicaragua to capture guns on their way to El Salvador. Let's entertain the loony idea that the Nicaraguans would change their current position and provide the Soviet Union with a military base and support the Soviets in an attack on the Panama Canal, Honduras, or the United States. Why would the Soviet Union start World War III in such an absurd way? Nuclear missiles launched from the Soviet Union and from submarines would be far more homicidal and just as suicidal. But then, some people believe we are going to fight a drawn-out conventional war with the Soviets. We must be sure the Nicaraguans aren't helping the Cubans attack the shipping lanes through the Panama Canal and Caribbean. We might run out of oil in a few months and have to surrender. Lucky we eliminated the threat from Grenada. Don't bring up embarrassing questions like, where would Cuba and Nicaragua get their O-11 during this prolonged war, assuming the US didn't blow them to smithereens early on? And why would the US be ignoring its global warfighting plan, which is premised on the notion of a prolonged, but limited nuclear war? It's so much simpler and scarier to believe the Red Dawn movie is for real. We'll survive World War III with the Soviets if only the Cubans and Nicaraguans aren't around to help the Russians when provided, of course, there are enough shovels and change of address forms to go around. The Cold War subs the hot war, which has already killed a higher percentage of the Nicaraguan population than the US lost during the Vietnam War. Within the US, the war on Nicaragua has appeared as an on-again, off-again sideshow. It generates short bursts of widespread attention when Congress debates and authorizes its funding, and when particularly seamy US activities are exposed, such as the CIA-directed mining of Nicaragua's harbors, which set a precedent for terrorism against countries with which the US has formal diplomatic relations and against international shipping. Another scandal arose over the CIA manuals providing guidance on sabotage and political assassination. Often, major events, like the bombing of Managua's International Airport. 50 Reagan, Trilateralism, and the Neoliberals. B.A. Austin. Marlette. Nicaragua admitted today to the mining of New York Harbor to force the U.S. to change Cruz stay in the race, because then the Sandinistas could justifiably claim that the elections were legitimate, making it much harder for the United States to oppose the Nicaraguan government. *8. The U.S. media played its required part and followed the administration lead in reporting on the election, particularly in using the candidacy of Arturo Cruz as a litmus test of legitimacy, negating its own reporting to the contrary. In fact, Cruz represented a right-wing coalition which had no chance of winning a fair election. Cruz, who broke with 52 The revolutionary government, after serving as ambassador to the U.S., represented the Democratic Coordinating Committee, an alliance of the Superior Council of Private Enterprise and the four most conservative political parties, Constitutionalist Liberal Party, PLC, with barely a few hundred members, Social Democratic Party, PSD, the vehicle of La Prensa editor Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, Social Christian Party, PSC, the largest and least conservative member of the coalition, and the Nicaraguan Conservative Party, PCN, founded in June 1984. COSEP has received $150,000 from the U.S. Endowment for Democracy, and La Prensa, which was a partisan of the CDN during the election, and not the voice of an independent press or even of the other opposition, has received $100,000. According to the report of the U.S. Latin American Studies Association delegation, the weight of the evidence suggests that the Coordinadora Group made a policy decision to pursue its political goals in 1984 outside of the electoral process, and there is circumstantial evidence, reinforced by a senior U.S. diplomat in Central America with whom the group talked, that the decision not to run was made as early as December 1983. 3 According to the LASA report, the electoral process was designed, through months of debate in the Council of State, to create the greatest possibility for minority party representation, using a standard model of proportional representation. This model tilts the system toward much more pluralism than would have been created, for example, by a U.S.-style single-member district system. Both the registration process and the voting process was designed meticulously to minimize the potential for abuses. The Nicaraguans used Swedish technical assistance in the design of the registration cards, ballots, the precinct procedures, and the reporting procedures. All parties in the election were given equal allotments of free airtime on television. Over 1.1 million Nicaraguans voted, representing a high turnout of 75.4% of the registered electorate. FSLN presidential candidate, Daniel Ortega, won with 67% of the vote, and the FSLN won 61 of 96 seats in the National Assembly. The Democratic Conservative Party came in second, winning 14% of the presidential vote and 14 assembly seats. The Independent Liberal Party was considered the strongest opposition to the FSLN, but less than 2 weeks before the election their presidential candidate, Virgilio Godoy, announced he and the party were withdrawing. The vice presidential candidate and several assembly candidates continued running, and in this confused situation the PLI ended up with 9.6% of the vote and 9 seats. The Popular Social Christian Party won 5.6% and 6 seats, and 3 left-wing parties, the Socialist Party, Communist Party, and Marxist-Leninist Popular Action Movement, split 3.8% of the vote and won 2 seats each. 53. Most international observers, including LASA, the mission sent by the Washington Office on Latin America, and the International Human Rights Law Group and the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group, judged the elections to be free whatever specific shortcomings they cited. Rejecting peace efforts. In the words of President Reagan's April 1983 speech to Congress, Nicaragua has rejected our repeated peace efforts once again. Reagan has rejected reality. As early as February 1981, when the U.S. released the White Paper, Nicaragua called for joint Nicaraguan-Honduran border patrols. The U.S. preferred joint U.S. Honduran military maneuvers. In October 1981, Nicaragua endorsed the now-forgotten French-Mexican proposal for a negotiated settlement in El Salvador. The U.S. wanted a military victory in both El Salvador and Nicaragua. In November, Reagan authorized the first official installment of Contra assistance. Roy Gutman, a defense and foreign affairs reporter for Newsday, describes the U.S. role in negotiations with Nicaragua as America's diplomatic charade. What's wrong with a little target practice? Roger. 54. From late 1981 until summer 1984, when Secretary of State George Shultz visited Managua, the exchanges seemed to be mainly posturing for public effect. Indeed, at no point were U.S. demands, which have changed at a dizzying pace, formally presented in writing. Although the Sandinistas bear some of the blame for the failure of diplomacy, throughout the on-again, off-again talks U.S. officials operated in a manner that guaranteed their failure. After the August 1981 talks broke down, the administration's energies went into a build-up of military pressure. American rhetoric became increasingly shrill, and by late 1983 progress toward already stated U.S. goals no longer was the criterion for success. The diplomatic charade only got worse. When progress was made in the Contadora negotiations during December and January 1983–84, the Reagan administration responded with the mining of Nicaragua's harbors. In September 1984, a Contadora draft treaty was endorsed by the four sponsoring nations Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama after 20 months of negotiations with Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Costa Rica and Guatemala. It contained provisions for the withdrawal of foreign military advisors, prohibition of foreign military bases and interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and controls on the level of arms and troops in the region, and it calls for the establishment of conditions for free elections. By most accounts, Nicaragua surprised the Reagan administration by signing the treaty on September 21. The administration responded by persuading its allies in the region to make new objections to the treaty, calling it unverifiable and favorable to Nicaragua. A secret National Security Council paper takes pride in the successful U.S. sabotage of the Contadora Treaty. We have trumped the latest Nicaraguan/Mexican efforts to rush signature of an unsatisfactory Contadora agreement. Washington's problem with the September 1984 Contadora draft treaty was that it is symmetrical and not biased in favor of the U.S. It would eliminate U.S. military maneuvers in the region and prohibit U.S. military bases and advisors, not just Cuban and Soviet, and it would require suspension of outside aid to the Contras as well as the FMLN. A September 1985 draft treaty favors the U.S. by calling, for example, only for a reduction in international military maneuvers with a view to their elimination. Because the U.S. employs these maneuvers to supply the Contras and strengthen U.S. forces in the region, the Nicaraguan government rejects this formulation, as well as other changes in the draft favoring the United States. 2 On January 18, 1985, the administration suspended the bilateral negotiations with Nicaragua which had been taking place since June 1984 in Manzanillo, Mexico. Also on January 18, the Reagan administration walked out on proceedings in the International Court of Justice over Nicaragua's suit against the United States. In May 1984, the World Court had issued a preliminary ruling that the U.S. 55. This along with Adolfo Calero and Alfonso Rabello, co-founder of ARDE with Eden Pastora. But reports indicate he is growing frustrated with his lack of real influence within the 1%. In Contra-Terror in Nicaragua, Reed Brody documents how Contra forces have committed repeated assaults upon the Nicaraguan people, including rape, kidnapping, torture, mutilation, murder and massacres. In account after gruesome account, he describes Contra atrocities, including decapitation, using women and children for target practice, gang rape and other forms of torture and mutilation, including castration, gouging out eyes and cutting out tongues, ears, and noses. Nicaraguans call the Contras bestia, beast. The U.S. bears direct responsibility for Contra atrocities. The Contras are a U.S. proxy army. In March 1984, an unnamed U.S. diplomat in Honduras described the Contra role as a no-lose instrument of pressure. The Contras are strictly an instrument of pressure. Some people around here and in Washington really thought, and still do, I guess, that they could incite an insurrection and overthrow the Sandinistas. I always thought that was a lot of crap. But in any event, the theory was that we couldn't lose. If they took Managua, wonderful. If not, the idea was that the Sandinistas would react one of two ways. Either they'd liberalize and stop exporting revolution, which is fine and dandy, or they'd tighten up, alienate their own people, their international support and their backers in the United States, in the long run making themselves much more vulnerable. In a way, that one was even better, or so the idea went. *degree. Knocking down the walls. On a visit to Nicaragua in 1984, I had the opportunity to meet with Dora Maria Tellez as part of a delegation sponsored by MADRE, AU's Central American Friendship Association. Dora Maria Tellez, now Minister of Health, was a Sandinista guerrilla leader and has held various party and government posts since 1979. We asked her how she compared the revolutionary struggle with running the government. She answered, "An absolute difference. If they give you the work of knocking down this house, you start breaking walls, windows, everything. But if they tell you now build the house, first you have to learn to be a stonemason, then learn the ratio of cement to stone, dig up the old foundation, put in the new foundation, put up the walls. And when you've put the walls up, the roof on, everything else, then you have to fix the inside of the house, furniture and so on." When asked about Reagan's impact, Tellez responded, "What would we do if there was no Reagan? We destroyed the house, dug out the foundation, put in a new foundation and started putting up the house. When we're putting up a wall, Reagan comes and knocks down one we put up on the other side. So, we have to rebuild the wall he knocked over, and while we're doing that, he knocks over a different one. If he weren't there we could finish the house, and even put the roof on." 59. Not only does the US keep knocking down walls, it blames Nicaragua for being an inept builder. Just as the Nicaraguan military buildup is discussed without reference to the war, so too are the country's economic problems. Yet, common sense would indicate that wartime destruction, rising defense costs, economic embargo, and an effective, but little publicized, U.S. campaign to block international credit and assistance would promote economic problems. Indeed, that's exactly what the U.S. intends. All of this comes on top of the billions of dollars in damage and capital flight during the insurrection against Somoza, and in the context of economic crisis throughout Latin America. Contrary to the doom and gloom which passes for administration information on Sandinista economic policies, Nicaragua had the highest rate of economic growth and investment in Latin America between 1980 and 1983. In 1983, Nicaragua's gross national product grew by 5.1% while other Latin American economies declined. The agrarian reform program has been highly successful. Crop production rose 38.6% between 1981 and 1983. Between 1979 and 1983, the government undertook extensive rural electrification and water purification projects and greatly expanded health, education, daycare, and other social services. Illiteracy was reduced from 52 to 12%, infant mortality was halved, to the lowest level in Central America, polio and measles were virtually eradicated and, in 1982, Nicaragua received a World Health Organization award for the greatest achievement in health by a third world nation. Contra attacks have wreaked havoc on Nicaragua's ability to maintain and expand reconstruction achievements since the revolution. Nicaragua now devotes some 50% of the national budget to the war effort. Health workers, teachers, and government employees in agriculture, construction and other ministries have been special Contra targets with U.S. knowledge. Dwayne Dewey Claridge, former CIA division chief in charge of Nicaraguan paramilitary operations, told congressional committees in a secret briefing in late 1983 that civilians and Sandinista officials in the provinces, as well as heads of cooperatives, nurses, doctors and judges had been killed by the Contras. He explained that this didn't contradict the presidential directive against assassination because these events don't constitute assassinations because as far as we are concerned assassinations are only those of heads of state. When the Reagan administration declared an embargo in May 1985 describing Nicaragua as an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, it was one more step in a systematic campaign designed to isolate and destabilize Nicaragua. Reagan is not being contradictory as some critics allege, pushing Nicaragua into the hands of the Soviet Union. Washington is quite purposefully creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, ensuring that Nicaragua moves closer to Washington's portrait of Soviet proxy, thereby strengthening the Contra lobby in the United States. Daniel Ortega's trip to Moscow ill-timed for U.S. politics, but quite legitimate. 60. Corporate Camelot, Guatemala. Ed Rabel, CBS reporter, Americans have fought for a long time to stay in Guatemala. There was also a lot to be had. One big American company had almost all of it. The whole country of Guatemala was once virtually a branch office of the United Fruit Company. In the 1950s, it held two-thirds of the usable farmland and monopolized the nation's railroad in its multimillion-dollar banana empire. When a democratically elected president named Jacobo Arbenz tried to institute a land reform program in 1954 so that poor farmers could have land of their own, United Fruit lobbied the Eisenhower administration to intervene. The CIA stepped in and overthrew the Guatemalan leader. From that day to this, Guatemalans have lived under nearly constant government harassment. Sherwood's own personal holdings are considerable: a rubber plantation, a cement factory, and part of a textile mill which he manages. It's an ideal place to invest, he says, because profits are high, costs are low. Sherwood pays workers at his textile mill about $4.50 a day. Rabel, is the government pretty cooperative? Sherwood, oh, yes. They're very cooperative. We don't have restrictions as to environmental things, and there's just no restrictions or rules at all, so that makes it nice. Rabel, are the people here oppressed in any way? Sherwood, really, don't think so. Know of no individual, know of no one. I have lived here for 36 years, I've been in farming, in industry, in commerce, and don't know of anybody being impressed. No one forces them to do anything. And think this is just something that some reporters have thought up. Rabel, want to ask you a question about something a politician here in this country told me. And he said that more than 120 of his party's leaders had been assassinated in about an 18-month period. I'm just wondering what you make of that kind of statement. Sherwood, well, first place, I'd very much question it, because don't think there's been 120 people of all types assassinated here in the last year. Mean, I'm not counting the peasants or the mean men of that category. No, think that's probably exaggerated to a great extent. There were a couple of politicians assassinated a couple of years ago, but believe me, they were way out in left field, and well, these people are, our enemies. They're there against our way of life. And maybe assassination is not the right word for it, but don't think they should be allowed to run free to try to destroy our form of government, our way of life, in other words. Source, transcript of Guatemala, CBS reports, with CBS News correspondent Ed Rabel, broadcast September 1, 1982. 61. From the Nicaraguan perspective became the excuse eagerly grabbed by many Democrats to relieve themselves of the burden of opposition. U.S. politicians consider it an insult when Nicaragua acts like a sovereign country, and not a neo-colony. The real threat to U.S. elites is the threat of a good example. That Nicaragua will succeed in pursuing a non-aligned path outside the U.S. bloc and the Soviet bloc. That it will succeed in building a working mixed economy of private and public enterprise. That it will succeed in creating a pluralistic, participatory democratic political system. That it will succeed in raising living standards. That it will succeed in agrarian reform, achieving food self-sufficiency and wiping out malnutrition. That it will succeed in achieving a high degree of literacy and education. That it will succeed in achieving equal rights and participation for women. The threat of this success to the U.S. is not the loss of Nicaragua itself as a cheap labor and resource provider. Direct U.S. corporate investment in Nicaragua was never very high, although it had great impact upon Nicaragua, and many investors pursued good relations with the new government. It is the cumulative loss of Central America, the Caribbean, and South America as a captive sphere that so threatens the U.S. The threat is not that the Soviet Union will gain the region. It won't. The threat is that the U.S. will lose its hegemony. Nicaraguans are not fighting for the Soviet Union, but for their own lives, livelihoods, and self-determination. Today, the average US cat eats more beef than the average Central American person *. Some 50,000 Nicaraguans died in the rebellion against Somocismo and its hunger, illiteracy, and terror. It is not the destiny of Central Americans to be miserable, as Jeane Kirkpatrick preaches. It is the legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism. It is the legacy of the US right to intervene. It is a legacy that must end. No, no, no Jose/. That's humanitarian. AKID this one's the money. For bullets and bombs. Equals Dan Wasserman. EC Utrania SEOSNI Senren and CEE. Beyond arrogance and paranoia. Across the relevant spectrum, there is a shared belief in the right to intervene. In June 1985, as Congress debated whether to supply so-called humanitarian aid to the Contras, House Majority Leader Jim Wright warned that approval would mean, for the first time we're going to be saying that we are accessories to overthrowing the government of Nicaragua. Both the House and Sen no Alanang, 8 gave Reagan a green light. For fail to appreciate is that Mr. Marcos is the no recruiting agent for the Communist Party in the Philippines. The longer he remains in power, the greater the chances that the Communists will prevail. Those who fear the consequences of Mr. Marcos's resignation or removal look to what happened in Iran and Nicaragua after the fall of the Shah and the Somoza dynasty. They conclude that, while Mr. Marcos may not exactly be a choir boy, he is our son of a bitch, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said of Anastasio Somoza. Most Americans agree that the mullahs and the Sandinistas are far worse than the tyrants they replaced. It does not necessarily follow, however, that the demise of an authoritarian government inevitably leads to an even more repressive regime. The Sandinistas, in reality, are infinitely better than the tyrant they replaced. But that is not the real concern of US policymakers. The real concern is that the Sandinistas dare to be sovereign. In his commentary following Corazon Aquino's ascendancy in the Philippines, CBS News anchor Dan Rather expressed concern that the Filipinos might move toward a non-aligned third-worldist policy. Stripped of the camouflage red of communism, the threat is self-determination. A utopian view of U.S. foreign policy has gained currency in the wake of the fall of Marcos in the Philippines and Duvalier in Haiti. In the words of New York Times commentator Anthony Lewis, there is a new consensus in this country on human rights in foreign policy. Americans across the political spectrum are not prepared to tolerate crude abuses of power by tyrants simply because they call themselves pro-American. There is no such consensus. U.S. foreign policy has always rested upon the abuse of power by itself and its allies, and it does so today. It will do so until the U.S. is prepared to drop its special claim to the labor and resources of other countries. Liberals are not prepared to drop this claim, for upon it rests the privileges of the U.S. ruling class of which they are a part. What liberals are prepared to do differently than the right, is negotiate the terms upon which this claim is enforced. The democracy doctrine, a Trojan horse. What happened in the Philippines was not an American celebration of global democracy, but a demonstration election gone awry. As authors Frank Broadhead and Edward Herman argue, a demonstration election is designed to legitimize a U.S.-backed regime in the eyes of the American public. In the hollow center of this Trojan horse democracy are the weapons of counterinsurgency. Reagan officials did not expect the opposition to unite around Cory Aquino and Doy Laurel. They expected Marcos to win re-election as he did in 1981, when George Bush toasted him, "We love your adherence to the democratic principle and democratic process." They expected Marcos's electoral fix to work, not backfire. When it became clear that the groundswell of support behind Aquino would drown Marcos, no matter how hard he tried to steal the election, Reagan officials apparently tried for a next best demonstration election, a partial fraud through which 64 Reagan, trilateralism, and the neoliberals. Marcos would allow Aquino's more conservative vice presidential candidate Laurel to win and join a transitional coalition government. In one of the more obscene displays of electoral intervention by the U.S. media, Nightline host Ted Koppel pressed Laurel to commit himself to accept the vice presidency under Marcos in order to heal the wounds of Filipino society. Special Ambassador Philip Habib apparently went to Manila to arrange a coalition government, whether with or without Aquino is not clear. Aquino had the mettle to hold out for victory, and the U.S. found again that dictators don't go quietly just because Washington finds they have outlived their usefulness. Marcos would leave only after the U.S. sanctioned military rebellion by Defense Minister Enrile and General Ramos, two key bridges between the Marcos past and the Aquino future. Just as Duarte's democratic credentials opened the floodgates to U.S. support for counterinsurgency in El Salvador, so it is hoped that Aquino and the refurbished military will be able to wage a victorious campaign against the revolutionary New People's Army. At this writing, one can only hope that Aquino will attempt to follow up her unexpectedly broad release of political prisoners and pursue serious peace negotiations with the rebels as part of a genuine commitment to radical transformation of the Philippine political economy. Whatever Aquino's actual motives, however, the U.S. will apply intense pressure for a rebel defeat and minimal reform. These have been busy times for U.S. proconsuls. News reports indicate that the U.S. ambassador to Haiti, Clayton McManaway Jr., a CIA veteran heavily involved in the Phoenix program death squads in Vietnam, which, according to the former CIA station chief in Saigon, William Colby, achieved the neutralization of nearly 60,000 Vietnamese, played a role in deciding the composition of the military-dominated government in talks which reportedly began at least a week before Mr. Duvalier fled on February 7 to France. U.S. policy shapers across the relevant spectrum are clearly enamored with their growing role in bringing democracy to the neo-colonies. The democracy doctrine is a bipartisan show. The media loves it. The Philippines gave us the smiling revolution. Expect a future mini-series, South Korea, Saga of the Two Kims. In early March, a delegation of U.S. politicians went to South Korea to assess chances for greater democracy. At a news conference at the home of opposition leader Kim Dae-jung, Representative Thomas Foglietta of Pennsylvania remarked, "We are not trying to force our ways of life to South Koreans. But we want to export the finest American product. Democracy registered. What country will be next? Chile without Pinochet? What about Paraguay, Zaire, Saudi Arabia? Imagine a lifestyles of the rich and tyrannical." Report from the homes of the Saudi dynasty. Countries are made safe for U.S. style democracy through terror. Two political parties are preferred, the dictator's party and the mode. 65. Rate opposition. Death squads disappear large numbers of reformers and radicals, and frighten the moderates. Surviving popular radical leaders are best kept in exile or jail until the election is over, as in Uruguay. If Nicaragua had followed the U.S. example, it would have eliminated all opposition forces and then held an election. The democracy doctrine is a response to popular revolt. It aims to preserve the authoritarian global rule of the United States. In the Philippines, the perceived stakes are the Subic Bay and Clark air bases, with their nearby prostitution enclaves, and multinational corporate investment, especially in the export processing zones, where wages for U.S.-owned electronic plants are $34 to $46 a month registered. The democracy doctrine won't work in the long run. People can't eat ballots. Just as the Alliance for Progress left a string of national security states in its wake, demolishing established democracies in Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and elsewhere, so the democracy doctrine may lead to the same result as the needs of the poor majorities press against the barricades of elite U.S. interests. The debt crisis will play an important role. In 1984, Third World governments owed Western governments and banks $895 billion, a sum equivalent to the money poured into armaments around the world. The 7 largest debtor countries are Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, South Korea, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Much of the money has been poured down the rathholes of corrupt regimes which welcomed Western corporations in the mutually beneficial plunder of their countries. Peasants and workers are being told to accept deadly austerity in order to pay the debts of their current or former oppressors. But when you are malnourished, Belt tightening means starvation. People don't voluntarily commit themselves and their children to hunger. Rainer Hatchfeld. Perpetual siege. During a visit by a group of U.S. citizens with a U.S. ambassador in Central America who has since been transferred, the ambassador was asked to explain how such U.S. actions as the mining of Nicaragua's harbors and bombing of airports differed from the acts of terrorism that the U.S. condemned around the world. The reply, off the record, was, "Well, you're not going to like this answer, but if they do it, it's terrorism; if we do it, it's fighting for freedom." The U.S. is the world's greatest terrorist state and few Americans know it. Directly and indirectly, the U.S. has placed much of the world under perpetual siege. The siege of the national security state. Or the siege of so-called low-intensity conflict. Blood runs, but it is mainly third world blood. It flows outside the everyday eyes of the mainstream media. It doesn't really count. Salvador is a good example of terrorism under the democracy doctrine. In The Continuing Terror, America's Watch reports that President Duarte's civilian government notwithstanding, the human rights situation in El Salvador remains terrible. Violations include aerial bombardments, strafing, mortaring and army ground operations that kill, maim and terrorize the civilian population and that deprive them of the food they need to survive, a resurgence in death squad activity, and the continuing, selective use of torture by the security forces, including such methods as electronic shock, hangings by arms and legs, the capucha and beatings. The United States bears direct responsibility for this terrible human rights situation. According to Alan Nairn, early in the 1960s, during the Kennedy administration, agents of the U.S. government in El Salvador set up two official security organizations that killed thousands of peasants and suspected leftists over the next 15 years. These organizations, guided by American operatives, developed into the paramilitary apparatus that came to be known as the Salvadoran Death Squads. 67. Today, even as the Reagan administration publicly condemns the death squads, the CIA in violation of U.S. law continues to provide training, support, and intelligence to security forces directly involved in death squad activity. Degree. U.S. arrogance and paranoia come to bear nicely in concentrating attention upon so-called international terrorism. International terrorism means acts of violence directed against Americans, rather than practiced by Americans. There is no comparison in the scope and intensity of violence. As Ed Herman points out in his book, The Real Terror Network. At the first Latin American Congress of Relatives of the Disappeared, held in San Jose, Costa Rica, January 20 to 24, 1981, the estimate given for disappeared men, women, and children in Latin America over the past 2 decades was 90,000. By contrast, the CIA's most recent estimate of the total number of deaths resulting from international terrorist violence for the period 1968 to 1980 numbers 3,668, or about 4% of the number of disappearances for Latin America alone. Since then, the numbers of disappeared have risen, many at the hands of death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala. These disappearers weren't trained in Libya or the Soviet Union, but rather at the U.S. Army School of the Americas in Panama, the Special Warfare Center in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and local police and military headquarters. International terrorism transforms the most mellow liberals into Rambo cheerleaders, shifting the debate over foreign policy even further to the right. Following the attack on the Rome airport, Senator Howard Metzenbaum fixed the blame on Libya and asserted in a television interview, "Maybe we're at that point in the world where Mr. Gaddafi has to be eliminated." He added that he intended his remark to be taken literally, meaning assassination. There is racism, of course, in all of this. Violence against third world people is freedom fighting or low-intensity conflict or, at worst, the renegade actions of unrepentant right-wing extremists. Terrorism is violence by Arabs and other people of color against white people. When Palestinian Alex Odeh, the West Coast director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination League, was assassinated in the US. It was only briefly reported and largely forgotten. The New York Times didn't run front-page spreads with his picture. The networks didn't hound his family and friends for reaction stories. That would spoil the international terrorist plot, so useful in distracting attention from the perpetual siege. It's morning again in America. The American national insecurity state is busily defending global interests it has no right to claim, and becoming more xenophobic as the rightful claimants rebel. Military spending is heading skyward. Fiscal year 1986 defense outlays will be the highest since 1946 except for peak spending for the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The costs of U.S. militarism can best be described in comparisons. 68. The 1981-85 U.S. military budget of over $2 trillion greatly exceeded the sum total of a year's worth of all the goods and services the combined gross national products of Latin America, Australia, Africa, Southeast Asia, and India, plus all the oil produced in the Middle East. The budget of the U.S. Air Force is larger than the total educational budget for 1.2 billion children in Africa, Latin America, and Asia excluding Japan. TT costs $590,000 a day to operate one aircraft carrier. And every day in Africa alone 14,000 children die of hunger or hunger-related causes, registered. According to Ruth Savard's World Military and Social Expenditures, there are enough nuclear weapons to kill every person now living 12 times over. Meanwhile, 1 adult in 3 cannot read and write, 1 person in 4 is hungry. 6 Behind the new patriotism, with its chant of USA, number 1, there is a new impoverishment. 1 out of 6 Americans lives below the poverty line, that includes 1 out of every 4 children under 6 years of age, and 1 out of every 2 black children. 2 out of 3 poor adults are women. In this, the richest country in the world, there are nearly 40 million poor, some greater than the combined populations of Canada, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. Downward mobility is the new norm. Bona fide yuppies are rare. Today, a 30-year-old male head of household earns about 10% less in real buying power than his father did at the same age. 8 What was once recession-level unemployment is now called recovery. The new floor for unemployment is about 7%, not counting millions too discouraged to keep looking for work and working part-time jobs because they can't find more. Over 40% of working-age black men are out of work, and less than 1 out of 2 black teenagers has the prospect of a job. Agriculture is in the midst of a severe depression, as slash-and-burn capitalism threatens to wipe out small family farms. Education cutbacks and the poverty draft are forcing millions of people, a disproportionate number being people of color, to join the military in search of a job. Change don't come easy. We've got a long way to go to take back this country and lift the perpetual siege. We can succeed if we realize that the key to changing foreign policy is domestic politics. There will be no new relevant spectrum for foreign policy without a new spectrum for domestic policy. So long as the country is dominated by competing elites, they will define the national interest as their own, and defend it with intervention. We can succeed if we act on the knowledge that work for peace and justice must go hand in hand, or we will never build a unified progressive movement. And without a unified progressive movement, there will be no peace and no justice. Perhaps that's been said so often it's a cliché, but that doesn't make it any less important. We can succeed if we find ways to reach the large numbers of young people who think they'll be all they can be through Ramboism and selfish side economics. We won't reach them with the slogan "No more Vietnams." If this generation is condemned to repeat the Vietnam War tragedy, it will be partly out of ignorance. Today's 18-year-old was born in 1968 and 5 years old when U.S. combat troops left Vietnam. Age 11, hostages were held in Iran and the country went through an orgy of anguish and hate. No thanks to Ronald Reagan, the hostages were released the day of his inauguration and, like the Olympics 4 years later when today's 18-year-old was 16, the celebration of American nationalism merged with the celebration of Reaganism. The stampede for Olympic gold was like the stampede over Grenada, the deck was stacked in favor of the U.S. The lesson was it's the win that counts, not how or why you get it. It's standing tall that matters, not how many backs you stand on. We can succeed if we build international bridges rooted in a firm foundation of mutual respect and understanding. Workers in other countries are not stealing American jobs any more than US workers are pricing themselves out of the job market. Workers everywhere have an interest in creating an economic system which rejects dependence upon cheap labor. Popular revolutions in other countries don't threaten the United States. They threaten the same structures of oppression which exploit poor and working people here. The initiatives they undertake in literacy, cooperatives, and grassroots democracy can serve as examples for Americans in the same way that progressive initiatives in the US can serve as examples abroad. No people hold a monopoly on creativity and progress, and no nation should pretend to. As residents of the reigning superpowers, US and Soviet citizens have a special burden. We must not only learn to coexist with each other, saving ourselves and the world from nuclear annihilation, we must stop our governments from ongoing intervention in the affairs of other countries. It is not the US which must contain the Soviet Union. 70. And vice versa. It is the respective citizenry of each country which must see to it that other nations can control their own destinies. The US sphere of influence is far larger than the Soviets, and the US record of intervention is far longer. Unraveling the web which binds that sphere will be the test of our humanity, and of our own democracy to be. Americans have made a difference. If not for the ANU apartheid movement, with its vital student component, Reagan's enthusiastic constructive engagement would still define US policy towards South Africa. There would be no embargo, and no disinvestment by corporations, universities, and local governments. In Central America, intervention has not been derailed, but the pace has been slowed. If not for public pressure, the US would be more deeply involved in Central America, possibly with an invasion of El Salvador and Nicaragua, certainly with more massive military aid to the Contras and, perhaps, recognition of the Contras as the legitimate government of Nicaragua on some spit of land bombed and terrorized into submission. Without public pressure, liberals in Congress would not have achieved even limited brakes upon military intervention. Much stronger action by the anti-intervention movement will be needed to stop the liberals from marching us 2 steps forward, 1 step back, into regional war in Central America by buying into a White House compromise on Nicaragua. In one insidious scenario, the administration would pursue another negotiating charade with a perfect pretext for further escalation of the war. At the end of the stipulated period for negotiations, the administration would blame failure to make progress upon the Sandinistas and Congress would further acquiesce to counter-revolutionary terror. We must continue our varied efforts to change US policy through education, electoral politics, grassroots organizing and civil disobedience. Thousands have taken individual and collective steps to act upon an alternate policy by breaking the economic embargo, providing aid to the Nicaraguan people and standing with Nicaraguans on the Honduran border, by boycotting the products of U.S.-backed oppressor regimes such as South Africa and Chile, by providing sanctuary to refugees from Haiti, El Salvador and Guatemala, by pledging to resist U.S. intervention in Central America and acting on that pledge in the face of so-called low-intensity warfare, by withdrawing savings from banks which invest in South Africa, by supporting the few incumbent politicians and the many more new candidates with principled opposition to intervention, and by participating in and promoting the development of concrete policy alternatives such as the Changing Course Program of Policy Alternatives for Central America and the Caribbean and the Dellums Alternative Military Budget. We have made a difference. But a difference is not enough. As Congressman Ronald Dellums has said, the United States can no longer control the world, but we can destroy it to a degree piecemeal or wholesale. Now we must make a new policy.